The axe blade caught the morning sun as it swung toward Rowan Miles' head. Nora Callahan didn't think. She just moved, throwing herself between the rancher and the man who'd tracked her across 3 territories. Blood sprayed across the bread she'd baked that dawn. Behind them, a 4-year-old girl screamed her first sound in a year. This wasn't how Nora imagined her quiet bakery job would end. But then again, nothing about Rowan Miles' ranch had been what she expected. Not the silent child, not the widower's cold distance, and certainly not the way her heart had started to feel like it might finally have a place to rest. Stay with me until the end of this story, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Nora's journey travels. The wagon wheel hit another rut, and Nora Callahan's head struck the wooden slat behind her for the 14th time that hour. She'd stopped counting after 20. The freight driver, a weathered man named Hutchins who smelled of tobacco and indifference, hadn't spoken since they'd crossed into Montana territory 2 days ago. She preferred it that way. Questions led to answers, and answers led to truths she wasn't ready to share. Through the gap in the canvas cover, she watched the prairie roll past in endless waves of gold and green. Late August sun turned everything amber, and the wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something wild and untamed that made her chest tighten with a feeling she couldn't name. Freedom, maybe. Or just distance from everything she'd left behind. Her fingers traced the scar on her left wrist, hidden beneath her sleeve. 3 months old now, but still angry and red. A reminder of Jeb Rourke's grip, his whiskey-soaked breath in her face, his voice promising things that sounded like devotion but felt like ownership. The night she'd run, she'd left everything, her mother's china, her father's watch, the bakery she'd built from nothing in Silver Creek. Everything except her hands. And hands that could bake bread that made grown men weep could find work anywhere. "Whoa now!" Hutchins called, and the wagon lurched to a stop. "This is it, Miles Ranch." Nora pushed aside the canvas and stepped down, her boots sinking into dust that hadn't seen rain in weeks. Before her stretched a property that looked like it had been carved from the earth by an angry god. A 2-story ranch house stood to the left, its paint peeling, its porch sagging on one corner. A massive barn dominated the right side, and between them nothing but hard-packed dirt and the skeletal remains of what might have once been a garden. "You sure this is the place?" she asked. Hutchins spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Sign says Miles. You said Miles." He dropped her satchel beside her feet. "That'll be $2 for the ride." She counted out the coins from her dwindling purse, and Hutchins was gone before the dust settled, leaving her alone in a silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. The ranch house door banged open. A man emerged, and Nora's first thought was that he looked like something the prairie had tried to break but couldn't quite manage. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw sharp enough to split wood. He wore work clothes, faded denim, a shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, boots that had seen 1,000 miles of hard ground. But it was his eyes that caught her, gray as storm clouds, and just as welcoming. "You're 3 days late," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "The stage broke an axle outside Billings. I came as soon as I could." He looked her up and down with the same expression a man might give a horse he was considering buying, clinical, assessing. "You're smaller than I expected. I'm strong enough to need 50 pounds of dough before sunrise." That was the job description, wasn't it? She lifted her chin. "Unless you were expecting someone else." "I was expecting someone who could follow directions." The letter said August 25th. The letter also said you needed a baker, not a clock. She met his stare without flinching. 3 months ago she might have apologized, smoothed things over with a smile and soft words. But 3 months ago she'd still believed that making herself small kept her safe. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or the ghost of respect. "Name's Rowan Miles. You're the baker from Colorado?" "Nora Callahan." "Your letter said you worked in a hotel bakery. References?" She'd expected this. The references were fake, written by her friend Clara in handwriting different from her own, sealed with wax from a borrowed signet ring. But the skills were real. "I can bake you something now if you'd like to test me." "Kitchen's not ready. Storm took out part of the roof last week." He gestured toward the barn. "There's a shed behind the barn. It's clean, has a cot. You can sleep there." "A shed? You want a room in the main house?" His tone suggested this would be the first and last time he made such an offer. She thought of Jeb Rourke, of the way he'd cornered her in the bakery after hours, of his hands and his promises, and the dead look in his eyes that told her promises meant nothing. The shed is fine. Good. Work starts at 4 in the morning. I need bread for my ranch hands. 6 loaves daily. Simple stuff. No fancy glazes or decorations. On Sundays you can bake what you want, sell it in town if you've got extra. You keep those earnings. Everything else, you get $30 a month plus room and board. $30 was low, even for Montana. But it was money Jeb Rourke couldn't touch, in a place he'd never think to look. Agreed. One more thing, Rowan's voice dropped, taking on an edge that made her skin prickle. I have a daughter, Ellie. She's 4 years old. You don't speak to her, you don't go near her, and you sure as hell don't try to be her friend. Understood? The words hit like a slap. I'm here to bake bread, Mr. Miles, not... Understood? He repeated. Understood. He nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the house without another word, leaving her standing in the yard with her satchel and a growing certainty that she'd just agreed to work for a man who carried his own ghosts as heavy as she carried hers. The shed was better than she'd expected. Small, yes, barely 8 feet square, but clean, with a narrow cot, a trunk for storage, and a window that looked out over the prairie. Someone had left a quilt folded at the foot of the bed, its pattern worn but still beautiful. Whoever had made it knew how to turn scraps into something whole. Nora unpacked her few possessions: 2 dresses, a nightgown, her mother's silver hairbrush, and wrapped at the very bottom, her sourdough starter. She uncovered it carefully, relieved to find it still alive, still bubbling with the wild yeast she'd been feeding for 6 years. This starter had survived a flood, a fire, and a midnight escape through a second-story window. It would survive Montana. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of copper and violet, she ventured toward the main house. The kitchen, Rowan had said, was damaged but usable. She needed to assess what she had to work with. The back door stood ajar. She knocked, waited, then pushed it open. The kitchen was a disaster. Part of the roof had indeed caved in, leaving a gaping hole covered with canvas that snapped and billowed in the wind. Water damage stained the walls, and several floorboards had warped beyond repair. But the stove, a massive cast-iron beast, stood intact, and there was a work table, scarred and solid. She could work with this. "Who are you?" Nora spun around. A little girl stood in the doorway to the main house, so small and still she might have been a ghost. White blonde hair hung in tangles past her shoulders, and her dress, once probably blue, had faded to the color of a winter sky. But it was her eyes that made Nora's breath catch, wide and dark and filled with something too old for a 4-year-old to carry. "I'm Nora," she said softly, instinctively crouching to be at eye level. "I'm going to be baking bread here. What's your name?" The girl said nothing, didn't move, didn't blink. "Ellie." Rowan's voice cracked through the kitchen like a whip. He appeared behind his daughter, his face carved from stone. "What did I tell you?" Nora stood quickly. She just... "Ellie, upstairs, now." The little girl turned and ran, her bare feet silent on the wooden floors. Rowan advanced into the kitchen, and Nora forced herself not to back away. "I thought I made myself clear, Miss Callahan." She surprised me. I didn't seek her out. My daughter doesn't speak. Hasn't spoken in over a year. She doesn't need strangers trying to fix her, or save her, or whatever it is you think you're doing. His jaw worked. She doesn't need anything except to be left alone. She's 4 years old. She's my daughter. The words came out like broken glass. You work here, you bake, and you stay away from her. That's the agreement. If you can't follow it, you can catch the next wagon out. Nora met his stare, saw the pain beneath the anger, the grief wrapped so tight around him it had become armor. She recognized it because she wore her own version, different in shape but just as heavy. "I'll stay away from her," she said quietly. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once and left, his boots heavy on the stairs as he went after his daughter. Nora stood alone in the broken kitchen, listening to the canvas roof snap in the wind, and wondered what kind of tragedy could silence a child and turn her father into a man who looked at kindness like it was a weapon. 4 o'clock came early. Nora woke to darkness so complete she couldn't see her hand in front of her face. She dressed by feel, splashed cold water on her face from the basin, and made her way to the kitchen by lantern light. The pre-dawn air was cold enough to burn her lungs. Summer days might scorch the prairie, but the nights remembered that winter was always waiting. She lit the stove, coaxing it to life with kindling and patience, then assessed her supplies. Flour. Good quality, surprisingly. Yeast, salt, lard, a tin of honey. Basic, but she could work with basic. Her hands moved through familiar motions, measuring, mixing, the rough scratch of flour against wood, the give of dough beneath her palms. This was prayer for her. Not the word she'd been taught in church, but something older, more elemental. The transformation of simple ingredients into something that could sustain life. Magic that anyone could learn but few truly mastered. By the time the sun cracked the horizon, she had 6 loaves rising in pans, and the kitchen smelled like home, or what home was supposed to smell like, in the stories people told. Footsteps on the porch made her turn. Rowan entered, followed by 3 ranch hands who looked like they'd been carved from the same hard wood as their boss. They stopped short when they saw her, surprise flickering across their faces. "Morning, ma'am," the oldest one said, removing his hat. He had the look of a man who'd seen 60 years but could still work like he was 30. "Name's Jack Cordell. This here's Tommy Bledsoe and Martin Hayes. Nora Callahan." She wiped flour from her hands. "Bread won't be ready for another 20 minutes. "That's fine, ma'am. We got time." Jack glanced at Rowan. "Boss, you want us to start on that fence line after breakfast?" Rowan was staring at the loaves rising on the counter, his expression unreadable. "Yeah. Take Martin with you. Tommy, you're with me on the north pasture." The men nodded and filed out to wait on the porch, leaving Nora alone with Rowan. "Coffee?" she offered. "I'll get my own." He moved past her to the stove, poured a cup from the battered pot, and leaned against the counter. "You always start this early?" "Bread doesn't care about sleep schedules." Almost, she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. But then his expression hardened again, and he was back to being the man made of stone and silence. The bread came out perfect, golden crust, soft interior, the kind of texture that only came from knowing exactly when to pull it from the heat. She sliced one loaf while it was still warm, and the men crowded around like hungry wolves. "Lord have mercy," Tommy breathed after his first bite. He was younger than the others, maybe 20, with red hair and a face full of freckles. "This is real bread." "As opposed to fake bread?" Nora asked. "As opposed to the rocks we've been eating?" Martin grinned at Rowan. "No offense, boss." "None taken. I know my limitations." Rowan took a piece, bit into it, chewed slowly. His eyes closed for just a moment, and Nora saw something in his face shift. Some tightness ease, some old memory surface, and then sink again. When he opened his eyes, he found her watching him. "It's good," he said simply, and walked out. The men demolished the rest of the loaf and headed to work, leaving Nora with 5 remaining loaves and a kitchen that suddenly felt too quiet. She cleaned up, banked the fire, and was heading back to her shed when she noticed the little girl. Ellie sat on the porch steps of the main house, her knees pulled to her chest, watching Nora with those 2 old eyes. She wore the same faded dress from yesterday, and her hair still hung in tangles that probably hurt when the wind pulled them. Nora remembered Rowan's warning, remembered the steel in his voice, the pain beneath his anger. But she also remembered being young and lost and hungry for any small kindness. She walked to the kitchen, wrapped one of the remaining loaves in a clean cloth, and carried it to the porch. She didn't approach Ellie directly, just set the bread on the step 3 feet away, nodded once, and walked back to her shed. Behind her, she heard the soft sound of small feet on wood, then silence. That night, when she went to retrieve her cloth, she found it folded neatly on the same step, weighed down with a single white wildflower. The days developed a rhythm. Rise at 4, bake 6 loaves, leave one wrapped in cloth on the porch step. Each morning, Ellie watched from a distance. Each evening, Nora found her cloth returned with something small on top. A wildflower, a smooth stone, once a feather so blue it looked like a piece of sky had fallen. Rowan said nothing, but she felt him watching sometimes, his gaze heavy as he observed his daughter's slow orbit around the baker he'd forbidden her to know. The ranch itself was a study in managed chaos. Rowan ran it with 3 permanent hands and occasional day workers during busier seasons. They raised cattle primarily, with a small horse operation that Jack managed with the devotion of a man who preferred animals to people. The land itself was beautiful in a harsh way. Rolling prairie broken by coulees and rock formations that looked like ancient gods had played dice and left the pieces where they fell. Nora spent her free time working on the kitchen. She patched the roof with Tommy's help, replaced the damaged floorboards, scrubbed years of grime from surfaces that hadn't seen care in too long. The ranch hands watched her work with a mixture of admiration and confusion. "Boss usually hires men for that kind of work," Jack said one afternoon, finding her on a ladder with a hammer. "I'm here. The work needs doing. Seems simple enough." "You're not what we expected." "What did you expect?" He scratched his jaw, looking uncomfortable. "Someone older, I guess. Maybe harder. Boss doesn't usually—" He trailed off. "Doesn't usually what?" "Nothing, ma'am. Just talking out of turn." He handed her a nail. "You need help with that beam?" They worked in companionable silence, and Nora found herself grateful for these men who treated her with a careful respect that felt nothing like the hungry way men in Silver Creek had watched her. Here, she was the baker. Not Nora, the pretty young widow. Not Nora who smiled too much or needed protection or could be convinced with the right words and the right pressure. Just Nora, who made bread and fixed things and wanted to be left alone to rebuild her life one day at a time. 2 weeks into her employment, a storm rolled across the prairie with the inevitability of seasons changing. Nora had seen the clouds building all afternoon, massive thunderheads that turned the sky the color of a bruise. She'd secured the kitchen as best she could, checking the patched roof, moving anything valuable away from potential leaks. The storm hit at dusk with a violence that made her previous experience with weather seem quaint. Wind screamed across the prairie, strong enough to shake the shed. Rain came sideways, finding every crack and gap in the walls. Thunder cracked so loud it felt like the earth splitting open. Nora huddled on her cot, wrapped in the worn quilt, and tried not to think about the kitchen roof. She'd done her best with the repairs, but her best was self-taught and probably not enough against this kind of fury. A sound cut through the storm, high and terrified, and definitely human. She grabbed her lantern and ran into the rain without thinking, her nightgown soaking through instantly. The sound came again, and she followed it to the barn. The massive door hung partially open, slamming in the wind. Inside, she found Ellie pressed against a stall, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a soundless scream as lightning flashed through the gaps in the walls. "Ellie!" Nora rushed forward, then stopped herself. Rowan's warnings echoed in her head. But the child was terrified, and Nora wouldn't leave her like this. She approached slowly, her hands visible. "It's okay. It's just a storm. It sounds scary, but it can't hurt you in here." Ellie stared at her, shaking. "I get scared too sometimes," Nora said softly, settling herself on the ground a few feet away, close enough to help, far enough to not crowd. "When I was little, my mama used to sing during storms." "Want to know what she sang?" The girl didn't respond, but she wasn't running, so Nora began to hum. A simple melody her mother had sung a lifetime ago. Nothing fancy, just a tune that said, "You're not alone, you're safe, the storm will pass." Slowly, inch by inch, Ellie's shoulders dropped. The fear in her eyes dimmed to wariness, and when lightning flashed again, she didn't scream. "There you go," Nora whispered. "See? It's just noise. Just light. It can't touch you." Footsteps pounded through the rain, and then Rowan was in the doorway, soaked and wild-eyed. His gaze locked on Ellie, then shifted to Nora, and his expression went through a dozen emotions too fast to name. "She was scared," Nora said simply. "I heard her from the shed." He strode forward and scooped Ellie into his arms. The little girl buried her face against his neck, her small fists gripping his shirt. For a moment, father and daughter were a single unit of shared fear and relief. Then Rowan's eyes met Nora's over his daughter's head, and she saw something crack in his expression, some wall he'd built stone by stone beginning to shift. "Thank you," he said, the words rough and low. Then he carried Ellie out into the storm, heading for the main house. Nora sat alone in the barn, shaking from cold and adrenaline, listening to the rain hammer the roof and wondering what she'd just started. What? The morning after the storm dawned clear and scrubbed clean, the kind of day that made you forget the night's violence. Nora woke late, nearly 5 o'clock, and rushed to the kitchen, certain Rowan would have something to say about her tardiness. But when she arrived, she found the stove already lit and a pot of coffee brewing. Rowan stood at the counter, attempting to measure flour with the precision of a man defusing a bomb. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression was different, not soft. This man would probably never be soft, but open, fractionally. "Thought you might want to sleep in," he said. "After last night. I can start." "Finish your coffee first. Bread can wait 20 minutes. She poured herself a cup and leaned against the counter, maintaining a careful distance. They stood in silence, drinking coffee as the sun rose over the prairie, and for the first time since arriving, Nora felt something other than alertness. Not quite peace? Not yet, but maybe the distant promise of it. "Ellie hasn't been in the barn since her mother died," Rowan said suddenly. "Marie, my wife, she loved the horses. Used to take Ellie out there every morning." He stared into his cup. "Marie got sick last winter. Fever. The doctor couldn't—" He stopped, his jaw working. "Ellie was with her when she died. In the barn. She hasn't spoken since." Nora's chest tightened. "I'm sorry. I thought if I kept her away from people, kept things quiet, kept her safe—" He shook his head. "I don't know what I thought." "You thought you could protect her from more hurt." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw the question in his eyes. "How do you know?" "Because I know what it's like to hide from pain. Because I know that sometimes the only control you have is how small you can make yourself. Because I'm doing the same thing, just in a different way." But she said none of this. Instead, she pushed away from the counter. "I should start the bread." Rowan nodded and left her to her work. But something had shifted. Some invisible line had been crossed, and Nora wasn't sure if she should be grateful or terrified. Over the following days, Ellie began to appear more frequently, not approaching directly, but orbiting closer, sitting on the porch while Nora worked in the kitchen, standing at the window of the main house watching the bread rise, once even entering the kitchen doorway before losing courage and fleeing. Rowan no longer warned Nora away. He watched his daughter's gradual emergence like a man watching ice break in spring, hopeful but braced for disaster. 3 weeks into Nora's employment, Ellie appeared in the kitchen at dawn. Nora had her hands buried in dough, kneading with the rhythm she could do in her sleep. She looked up to find the little girl standing just inside the doorway, wearing a clean dress. Someone had been making an effort, and with her hair brushed into 2 neat braids. "Good morning," Nora said, keeping her voice calm and her hands moving. "Don't make a big deal of it. Don't spook her. I'm making bread. Want to watch?" Ellie took 1 step forward, then another. Then she was standing beside the work table, her head barely reaching the surface, watching Nora's hands with an intensity that made her seem older than her years. "This part is called kneading," Nora explained, adjusting her position so Ellie could see better. "You fold it, press it, turn it. Fold, press, turn. It makes the bread strong." Ellie's small hand reached out, hovering over the dough. "Want to try?" Nora asked. The little girl nodded, the first clear response Nora had seen from her. She tore off a small piece of dough and placed it in front of Ellie. "Just like I'm doing. Fold, press, turn." Ellie's hands were tiny and uncertain, but she mimicked Nora's movements with fierce concentration. The dough stuck to her fingers, refused to cooperate, fought her at every turn. But she didn't give up. They worked in silence, woman and child, flour dusting the air between them like snow. After a while, Ellie looked up at Nora with a question in her eyes and pointed at her own misshapen lump of dough. "What should we make with it?" Nora asked. Ellie nodded. "How about—" Nora shaped her own piece into a rough circle with 4 legs. "A horse?" Ellie's face lit up. The first real expression Nora had seen from her, and she began working her dough with renewed purpose, creating something that looked more like a lumpy star than an animal, but was clearly made with complete devotion. They baked the little horse alongside the regular loaves. It emerged from the oven burnt on one side, doughy on the other, listing at an alarming angle. It was perfect. Ellie picked it up carefully, cradling it like treasure. And for just a moment, so brief Nora almost missed it, her lips curved into something that might have been a smile. Rowan appeared in the doorway, and Nora's heart jumped. But he wasn't angry. He was staring at his daughter like he was seeing her for the first time in a year, and his expression held such naked hope it hurt to witness. Ellie ran to him, holding up her creation, and he dropped to one knee to examine it with the seriousness it deserved. His voice cracked. That's really good, sweetheart. Ellie pressed the bread horse into his hands, and Rowan closed his fingers around it carefully, like it was made of glass instead of flour and water and a little girl's determination. When he looked up at Nora, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, and he mouthed 2 words. Thank you. Nora turned back to her work, her own throat tight, and wondered when exactly she'd stopped being just the baker and become something more complicated, something dangerous, something that felt entirely too much like belonging. The old stone oven sat behind the barn, forgotten and crumbling. Nora discovered it during one of her exploratory walks around the property. It was the kind of oven her grandmother had used, built from river rock and clay, designed to hold heat for hours and bake bread with a quality the cast iron stove could never quite match. It was also completely unusable. The roof had collapsed, half the stones had shifted, and birds had nested in the firebox for what looked like several generations. That thing's been dead since before I bought this place, Jack said, finding her studying it one afternoon. Previous owner used it, I guess, but it'd take a mason to fix it proper. Or someone stubborn with too much time on their hands, Jack laughed. You serious? I can make better bread with that oven than anything else, if I can get it working. Boss won't pay for it. I'm not asking him to. Word of her project spread among the ranch hands with the speed of any good gossip. Tommy showed up the next morning with a shovel. Martin appeared with a wheelbarrow full of clay he'd dug from the creek bed. Even Jack, who'd initially been skeptical, started pointing out which stones were stable and which needed to be replaced. Rowan found them working on it 3 days into the project. What's this? He asked, his tone suggesting he already knew and wasn't sure how he felt about it. Fixing the oven, Nora said, not looking up from the mortar she was mixing. I didn't authorize this. I'm doing it on my own time. Not asking for payment. She placed a stone carefully, checking it was level. Better bread means happier ranch hands means they work harder. Seems like it benefits everyone. He was quiet for a long moment, then, You need anything? She looked up, surprised. More river rock for the repairs, and mortar would be helpful. I'll have Martin bring some tomorrow. He turned to leave, then paused. You know anything about masonry? I know enough not to burn the place down. That's not the reassurance you think it is. But he was almost smiling when he said it, and Nora felt something warm bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the August sun. The oven took 2 weeks to rebuild. By the time they finished, it was a thing of beauty, solid and clean, with a proper chimney and a firebox that would hold heat all day. Nora spent a full day curing it, building progressively hotter fires to seal the clay and prepare the stones. The first bake was a ceremony. The ranch hands gathered at dawn, watching like she was attempting to raise the dead. She loaded the oven with 6 loaves and sealed the door. An hour later, the smell of baking bread rolled across the yard like a blessing. When she pulled the loaves out, they were perfect. Crust crackled like autumn leaves, interior soft as clouds. The kind of bread that made you understand why people in stories traveled miles to find the best baker. Lord Almighty, Tommy breathed. That's bread. Even Rowan took a piece, and for just a moment his careful mask slipped and she saw something like contentment cross his face. That night, she baked an extra loaf, smaller, fancier than the daily bread. She braided it, brushed it with honey, baked it until it glowed golden in the firelight. When she finished, she wrapped it carefully and carried it to the main house. Rowan answered her knock, surprise flickering across his face. Something wrong? No, She held out the bread. I wanted to say thank you for letting me rebuild the oven, She paused, searching for words. For giving me a chance. He took the bread slowly, his large hands careful around it. In the lamplight from inside, she could see his face clearly, the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the weariness that went bone deep. "You've done more than I hired you for," he said quietly. "Ellie," he stopped, started again. "She's coming back. Because of you." "She's coming back because she's ready," Nora corrected gently. "Maybe." He looked at the bread in his hands, then back at her. "Nora, I need to tell you something." Her heart kicked. "All right. When I hired you, I didn't expect—" He exhaled roughly. "Hell, I'm not good at this." "Good at what?" "At saying I was wrong." The admission seemed to cost him. "I thought keeping Ellie isolated would help her heal. I thought keeping everyone at a distance was protecting her, but you've shown me different." "I just baked bread." "You did more than that, and you know it." His eyes met hers, and the intensity there made her breath catch. "So thank you for ignoring my stupid rules, for being kind when I didn't deserve it, for—" He shook his head. "For reminding me there's still good things in the world." Nora's throat tightened. "Rowan!" A sound from inside the house, glass breaking, followed by Ellie's frightened cry. Rowan spun and ran. Nora followed without thinking, her heart in her throat. They found Ellie in the kitchen, standing in a pool of water and broken glass, her feet bleeding. She'd been trying to get a cup from the high shelf and knocked over a pitcher. "Don't move," Rowan commanded, reaching her in 3 strides. He swept her up, carrying her away from the glass, his face pale. "I'll clean it up," Nora said. "You take care of her." She found a broom and carefully swept the glass while Rowan examined Ellie's feet at the kitchen table. The cuts weren't deep, but the little girl was shaking, tears streaming silently down her face. "Shh, sweetheart, it's okay," Rowan murmured, his voice gentler than Nora had ever heard it. "Just a little cut. We'll fix it." Nora brought clean water and bandages, and between them, they cleaned and wrapped Ellie's feet. The little girl bore it with the kind of stoic silence that spoke of too much experience with pain, and Nora had to look away from the trust in those dark eyes. When they finished, Ellie reached out and grabbed both their hands, her father's in her left, Nora's in her right, and held on like she was trying to physically bind them together. Rowan's eyes met Nora's over his daughter's head, and something passed between them. Not words, not even acknowledgement. Just a moment of shared understanding that this broken, healing, complicated thing they were building mattered. "Let's get you to bed," Rowan said to Ellie. He stood, lifting her carefully, then paused. "Nora, stay. Please. Just until she falls asleep." So Nora followed them upstairs to a room she'd never seen. A little girl's bedroom with faded wallpaper and a bed covered in quilts. Rowan tucked Ellie in with practiced care, and Nora sat in the chair beside the bed, humming the same tune she'd sung during the storm. Ellie's eyes drifted closed, her breathing deepened, and slowly her small hand released its grip on Nora's fingers. Rowan stood at the doorway, watching. When Nora finally rose to leave, he walked with her down the stairs, through the kitchen, out onto the porch where the night prairie spread before them like a dark sea. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said finally. "None of us do," Nora replied. "Marie, my wife, she was good at this. The mothering, the kindness. He raked a hand through his hair. "I'm just trying not to break her more than she's already broken." "You're a good father, Rowan." "I'm a father who's drowning and doesn't know how to ask for help." Nora turned to face him fully. "Then don't ask. Just let people help anyway." He studied her for a long moment, and in the moonlight his eyes were soft as smoke. "How'd you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm just someone who's been drowning too." The confession hung between them, and Nora waited for the questions. But Rowan just nodded slowly, like he understood exactly what she wasn't saying. "Good night, Nora," he said quietly. "Good night, Rowan." She walked back to her shed, feeling the weight of his gaze on her back, and when she finally lay down on her cot, she couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd said her name, like it was something precious he was learning to hold. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and possibility, and for the first time in 3 months, Nora let herself imagine a future that wasn't just about running away. Maybe, just maybe, it could also be about running toward something September arrived with cooler mornings and the first whisper of autumn in the air. The prairie grass turned from green to gold, and the cattle grew restless as the ranch hands prepared for the fall roundup. Nora had been at the Miles Ranch for 5 weeks, and the rhythms of the place had seeped into her bones like the scent of baking bread into wood. Ellie appeared in the kitchen every morning now, her small presence as natural as sunrise. She didn't speak, still hadn't uttered a single word, but her silence had changed quality. Where before it had been heavy with grief, now it felt more like patience, like she was waiting for the right moment to break it. They developed their own language, Nora and Ellie. A nod meant yes. A headshake meant no. Pointing indicated interest. And when Ellie took Nora's hand, which happened more frequently now, it meant stay close, I need you. Rowan watched this evolution with the wariness of a man who'd learned that good things could be taken away without warning. But he no longer tried to intervene. Some mornings, Nora would look up from her kneading to find him standing in the doorway, just observing his daughter shape dough into lopsided animals, and the expression on his face made her chest ache with something she refused to name. The ranch hands had accepted her completely now. Tommy brought her wildflowers he swore weren't for courting purposes, but just because the kitchen looked bare. Martin fixed the squeaky hinge on her shed door without being asked, and Jack, gruff, taciturn Jack, started teaching her about the horses, his weathered face lighting up whenever she asked questions about bloodlines and training methods. "You're good with them," he said one afternoon, watching her stroke the nose of a gray mare named Silver. "Horses know people. They can tell who's worth trusting." "What do they say about me?" Nora asked. "They say you got a gentle hand and a steady heart." He paused, adjusting his hat. "They say you belong here." The words settled into her like warmth, and Nora realized with sudden clarity that for the first time since leaving Colorado, she wasn't looking over her shoulder anymore. Wasn't waiting for Jeb Rourke to appear on the horizon. Wasn't planning her next escape. She was simply living, and it felt like breathing after being underwater. That evening, as she was closing up the kitchen, Rowan appeared with a wooden box under his arm. He set it on the counter with uncharacteristic awkwardness, not quite meeting her eyes. "What's this?" she asked. "Spices, herbs, some vanilla extract." He shifted his weight. "Thought you might want them for the Sunday baking." Nora opened the box carefully. Inside were treasures, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, dried lavender, real vanilla beans that must have cost a small fortune this far from any major city. Her throat tightened. "Rowan, this is too much." "It's not too much." He finally looked at her, and something in his gray eyes made her pulse quicken. "You've been here over a month. You work harder than I pay you for. He stopped, started again. "You've given my daughter back to me. Some spices don't even begin to cover that debt." "There's no debt." "There is to me." He reached out, almost touched her hand, then pulled back as if catching himself. "Nora, I want you to know that you're not just the baker here. You're—" He struggled with the words. "You're part of this place now, part of what makes it work. And I don't want you thinking you have to leave when the 2 months are up." Her heart stuttered. "You want me to stay?" "If you want to stay." His voice was rough. "I can pay you more. $40 a month. You can have a room in the main house if the shed's too cold come winter, or we can build you something better. Whatever you need." What she needed was standing right in front of her, but Nora couldn't say that, wouldn't say that, because wanting things, wanting people, had only ever brought her pain. "I'd like to stay," she said carefully. "The shed's fine, and $40 a month is more than generous." Relief washed over his face. "Good. That's good." He lingered, like there was more he wanted to say, then nodded once and left her alone with a box of spices and a heart that was beating entirely too fast. That Sunday, Nora baked cinnamon rolls that made the entire ranch smell like Christmas morning. She baked honey cakes studded with lavender. She baked bread so rich with butter and herbs it could have been a meal on its own. The ranch hands declared her a miracle worker. Ellie ate 3 cinnamon rolls and got frosting in her hair. And Rowan looked at Nora like she was something more than flour and water transformed. He looked at her like she was magic. The following Tuesday brought trouble in a form Nora should have anticipated but somehow hadn't. She was working in the kitchen up to her elbows in dough when she heard horses approaching, multiple riders coming fast. Her first instinct was to look for Ellie. The little girl was on the porch, playing with her dough animals, and her second instinct was to wipe her hands and step outside. 3 men dismounted in the yard. Strangers, all of them, with the kind of hard faces that came from living rough and caring less. The one in front was tall and lean, with a scar running from his eyebrow to his jaw and eyes like chips of flint. "Help you, gentlemen?" Jack appeared from the barn, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. "Looking for Rowan Miles," the scarred man said. "What's your business?" "Our business is with Miles, not his hired help." Tommy and Martin materialized from different directions, and Nora felt the air tighten with potential violence. She moved instinctively toward Ellie, positioning herself between the child and the strangers. Rowan emerged from the barn leading a horse, and his entire body went taut when he saw the visitors. "Garrett." "Miles." The scarred man smiled, but it was the kind of smile that promised pain. "Been a while." "Not long enough." Rowan handed the horse's reins to Martin and walked forward, his movements deliberate. "You're not welcome here." "That's harsh, considering our history." "Our history is exactly why you're not welcome." Rowan stopped 10 feet from Garrett, his stance wide, balanced, ready. "Say what you came to say and get off my land." Garrett's eyes drifted past Rowan to the house, to the porch, to where Nora stood with her arm around Ellie. His smile widened. "Heard you got yourself a new wife. Didn't take you long." "She's not my wife. She's my baker." The words came out flat and hard. "And she's none of your concern." "Pretty thing. Your taste improved." Garrett's gaze lingered on Nora in a way that made her skin crawl. "Though I gotta say, Miles, you always did have a talent for finding women who don't belong in places like this." Rowan took a step forward, and Jack immediately moved to flank him. "You've got 5 seconds to state your business before I have you removed." "Still so quick to violence." Garrett shook his head with mock sadness. "I'm here about the water rights. The creek that runs through your north pasture? Turns out part of it's on disputed land, and I'm the one disputing it." "Bullshit. That land's been Miles' property for 20 years. Got a surveyor who says different. Got papers, too, all legal and proper." Garrett pulled a document from his coat. "Says that creek and about 50 acres around it are actually public land, which means I can file a claim. Which means, come next month, you're going to have neighbors." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Nora could see the calculation happening behind Rowan's eyes, the way his jaw worked as he fought to control his temper. "You don't want that land," Rowan said finally. "You want money. How much?" "Now there's the Miles I remember. Always willing to buy his way out of trouble." Garrett folded the papers back into his coat. $500, and I'll forget all about my claim. That's robbery. That's business." Garrett swung back onto his horse. "You got 2 weeks to decide. After that, I file the claim, and you can fight it in court, which will cost you a lot more than $500, I reckon." He tipped his hat to Nora with exaggerated courtesy. "Ma'am, pleasure seeing such a pretty face out here in the middle of nowhere. You ever get tired of playing house with a broken man and his broken kid? You know where to find better company." Rowan moved so fast Nora barely saw it. One moment he was standing still, the next he had Garrett by the boot, yanking him half out of his saddle. "You ever talk about my daughter again, there won't be enough of you left for a grave. Understood?" Garrett's companions reached for their guns, but Jack and the others were faster. The yard erupted into a tense standoff, everyone armed, everyone ready. "Understood," Garrett said through gritted teeth. Rowan released him, and Garrett righted himself in the saddle, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. 2 weeks, Miles. Then we're neighbors whether you like it or not." The 3 men rode off, leaving a wake of dust and fury. Rowan stood in the yard, his hands clenched into fists, breathing hard. The ranch hands gave him space, their expressions grim. They'd all heard the threat. They all knew what it meant. Nora walked over slowly, still holding Ellie's hand. "Who was that?" "Garrett Hayes. Known him since we were kids." Rowan's voice was flat. "He's a liar, a cheat, and a man who holds grudges like other people hold religion." "What's this really about?" He looked at her, and she saw something dark and old moving behind his eyes. It's about Marie, my wife. He exhaled roughly. Garrett wanted to marry her. I married her instead. He's hated me for 15 years because of it. And now he's using the law to punish you. Now he's using the law to take everything I built. Rowan crouched down to Ellie's level, managing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Hey, sweetheart. You okay? Ellie nodded, but her face was pale, her earlier happiness completely erased. Go inside with Nora. I need to talk with the men. But Ellie shook her head and wrapped her arms around her father's neck, holding on tight. Rowan's eyes closed briefly, and when he lifted her, it was with the careful tenderness of a man holding the only thing that mattered. All right, he murmured. All right, you can stay. The ranch hands gathered around, and Nora stepped back to give them privacy. But Rowan stopped her with a look. You should hear this too. So she stayed, listening as they discussed options. The land claim was probably bogus, but proving it would require lawyers and time and money Rowan didn't have. $500 was a fortune, but losing the water rights to the north pasture would cripple the ranch. I got about 100 saved, Jack offered. You can have it. I got 50, Tommy added. Boys, I can't. You can and you will, Martin interrupted. This ranch is our home too. We're not going to stand by while some bastard takes it from us. Rowan's throat worked. That still leaves 300 I don't have. What about selling some cattle? Nora asked. Market's down. I'd have to sell at a loss, and even then... He shook his head. It's not enough time. They talked in circles for another hour, but no solution emerged. Eventually the hands drifted back to work, their faces troubled, and Rowan carried Ellie inside, leaving Nora alone in the yard with her thoughts spinning. $500. It might as well have been 5,000. But as she walked back to the kitchen, an idea began to form. Dangerous. Probably stupid. But possible. She had skills. She had an oven that could produce bread better than anything in 3 counties. And she had exactly 2 weeks. That night, after Ellie was asleep and the ranch had gone quiet, Nora knocked on the door of the main house. Rowan answered, looking exhausted. He'd removed his shirt, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the weariness carved into every line of his frame. Something wrong? He asked. I want to help. Nora, let me finish. She took a breath. I can bake. You've seen what I can do. What if I took orders? Special breads, cakes, pastries. There's a town 20 miles south, Copper Ridge. It's bigger than the local settlement, has more people with more money. I could sell there. That's a good thought. But even if you sold out every day, you couldn't make $300 in 2 weeks. What if I wasn't alone? What if we all worked together? The plan crystallized as she spoke. Jack knows people with horses to sell. Martin could advertise in town. Tommy could help with deliveries. And you, she met his eyes. You could let me try. Rowan stared at her for a long moment. This isn't your fight. Yes, it is. The words came out more forcefully than she'd intended. This place, this ranch, these people, your daughter, they matter to me. Maybe they shouldn't. Maybe I should keep my distance like I planned, but I can't. So let me help. Something shifted in his expression, surprise giving way to something deeper, something that made her pulse quicken. Why? He asked quietly. Why do you care so much? Because this is the first place I've felt safe in 3 years. Because your daughter looks at me like I'm someone worth keeping. Because when you smile, it feels like sunrise after a long night. Because everyone deserves to keep what they've built, she said instead. Rowan took a step closer, and suddenly the doorway felt very small. Nora Callahan, you're either the stubbornest woman I've ever met or the kindest. I can't figure out which. Can't I be both? His mouth curved into something that might have been a smile if smiles could carry weight and weariness and hope all at once. I guess you can. He reached out and very gently touched her cheek with the backs of his fingers. Thank you. The touch lasted only a heartbeat, but it burned through Nora like whiskey, warm and dangerous and absolutely impossible to ignore. Then he stepped back, and the moment broke like morning mist. We start tomorrow, he said. And Nora, if this works, If you help me save this place, I won't forget it." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and walked back to her shed with her heart pounding and her skin still tingling from where he touched her. Tomorrow they would begin the impossible task of baking their way out of disaster. Tonight, she would lie awake wondering when exactly she'd stopped running from her past and started building toward a future that included a broken man, his silent daughter, and a ranch that felt more like home than anywhere she'd ever lived. The next 2 weeks became a blur of flour and fire and determination. Nora woke at 3 instead of 4, maximizing every possible hour. She baked regular bread for the ranch, then spent the rest of the day creating specialty items: braided honey loaves, herb focaccia, cinnamon swirl bread, fruit tarts, butter cookies that melted on the tongue. The stone oven ran hot from dawn until dusk, and the kitchen became a factory of delicious chaos. Ellie appointed herself chief assistant. She rolled dough, shaped cookies with fierce concentration, and developed an uncanny ability to know exactly when something was 30 seconds from burning. The little girl still didn't speak, but her presence was a constant source of comfort, like having a small, determined shadow. The ranch hands threw themselves into the effort with startling enthusiasm. Jack rode to neighboring ranches, spreading word about Nora's baking and taking orders. Martin printed flyers on an old press in town, advertising the best bread in Montana, Miles Ranch Special. Tommy built crates for transport and made daily runs to Copper Ridge, returning with orders that grew larger each time. And Rowan transformed into something Nora hadn't seen before. Not the grieving widower or the protective father, but a man fighting for something with every ounce of strength he possessed. He handled the business side, negotiating prices, managing accounts, working numbers by lamplight long after everyone else had gone to bed. They fell into a rhythm, the 5 of them plus the ranch hands, moving like parts of a single machine. Sometimes Nora would look up from her kneading to find Rowan watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. Sometimes their hands would brush when he helped her carry supplies, and the contact would linger a heartbeat too long to be accidental. Something was building between them, as inevitable as dough rising, as undeniable as fire spreading through dry grass. But there was no time to acknowledge it, no time for anything except work. By the end of the first week, they'd made $87. It wasn't enough, but it was progress. Orders continued to grow as word spread about the quality of Nora's baking. A hotel in Copper Ridge wanted 50 loaves weekly. A general store owner requested cookies for his shelves. Even the local church asked about communion bread. "We might actually do this," Tommy said one evening, counting the day's earnings with wonder in his voice. "Don't celebrate yet," Jack warned. "We still got a week and over 200 to go." But hope had taken root. Nora could feel it in the way Ellie smiled more readily, the way the ranch hands worked with renewed purpose, the way Rowan's shoulders didn't carry quite as much tension. On the 10th day, disaster struck. Nora was loading the morning bake into the stone oven when a gust of wind, stronger than usual, sharp with the promise of an early storm, caught the door and slammed it shut on her hand. She heard the crack before she felt the pain. Then agony exploded up her arm in a white, hot wave. She bit back a scream and wrenched her hand free, cradling it against her chest. The door had caught her fingers at an angle, and she could already see swelling starting, could feel something grinding wrong in her hand when she tried to flex it. "Nora?" Ellie stood in the doorway, her eyes going wide with fear. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just go get your papa, quickly." The little girl ran, and Nora sank onto the ground, breathing hard, trying to assess the damage. She could move her thumb. Her index finger responded sluggishly, but her middle and ring fingers were already swelling, already turning colors that suggested something had broken, or at least badly bruised. Rowan appeared at a dead run, with Ellie on his heels and the ranch hands close behind. He dropped to his knees beside Nora, his face going pale when he saw her hand. "Let me see." She extended her arm, and he examined her fingers with gentle precision that belied his obvious panic. When he touched the middle finger, she couldn't suppress a gasp of pain. "Might be broken," he said grimly. "We need to get you to the doctor." "No." The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "No doctors." "Nora, if it's broken, then wrap it and let it heal." She met his eyes, trying to will him to understand. Doctors asked questions. Doctors kept records. and records could lead Jeb Rourke right to her door. Please, Rowan, just wrap it tight and I'll be fine. He studied her face for a long moment, and she saw understanding dawn. He didn't know the specifics of what she was running from, but he recognized the fear. All right, he said softly. No, doctor, but you're not arguing with me about the rest. He carried her to the house, just scooped her up like she weighed nothing, and strode across the yard while she protested that she could walk perfectly fine, thank you very much. He deposited her at the kitchen table and sent Tommy running for bandages and cold water. The next 20 minutes were a study in controlled panic. Rowan wrapped her fingers together for stability, his touch impossibly gentle despite his obvious worry. Jack soaked cloths in cold water to bring down the swelling. Martin hovered uselessly, offering increasingly absurd home remedies involving whiskey and prayer. And Ellie climbed into Nora's lap and wrapped her small arms around her middle, holding on like she could keep Nora safe through sheer force of will. I'm okay, Nora murmured, stroking the girl's hair with her good hand. Just clumsy. I'll be more careful. But everyone in the room knew what this meant. Without her dominant hand, Nora couldn't knead dough properly, couldn't shape intricate pastries, couldn't maintain the pace they needed to reach their goal. After the men left, Rowan pulled a chair close and sat watching her with haunted eyes. We'll figure something else out, he said. There is no something else. We have 4 days left and need almost $200. Then I'll sell the cattle at a loss. I'll mortgage the land. You'll let me keep working. She lifted her bandaged hand. It's not my writing hand. I can still roll dough, still manage the oven, still do most of what needs doing. I just need help with the heavy kneading. Nora, I'm not stopping. Her voice carried a steel she'd learned in the weeks since leaving Colorado. This ranch matters too much. Your daughter matters too much. She paused, then added softly, You matter too much. The words hung between them, impossible to take back, too honest to ignore. Rowan's hand came up slowly, cupping her face with a tenderness that made her throat tight. You scare the hell out of me, Nora Callahan. Why? Because I'm starting to need you, and needing people. His voice rough. Needing people means you can lose them. You won't lose me. You don't know that. Neither do you. She turned her face into his palm. But we could spend our whole lives afraid of what might happen. Or we could just live. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, saw the wan in his eyes, felt the tension coiled in his frame. But then Ellie stirred in her lap, and Rowan pulled back, the moment fracturing. Get some rest, he said, standing abruptly. Tomorrow, we'll figure out a new plan. He left before she could respond, and Nora sat in the growing darkness with his daughter sleeping in her arms, wondering if there would ever be a right time for the impossible things building between them. The next 3 days were brutal. Nora worked with her hand bandaged, adapting her technique, pushing through pain that made her eyes water. Rowan took over the heavy kneading, his larger hands awkward with the dough, but learning quickly. Ellie became quality control, tasting everything with the serious expression of a professional critic, and somehow, impossibly, they maintained their output. Orders kept coming. The hotel increased their request to 75 loaves. A wealthy rancher's wife wanted an elaborate birthday cake for her husband. The church commissioned bread for a wedding. By the 13th day, they'd reached $430. By the 14th day, the last possible day, they had $487, $13 short. They gathered in the kitchen at sunset, all of them exhausted, flour-dusted, running on determination, and not much else. We could ask for more time, Martin suggested. Garrett won't give it, Rowan said flatly. He wants this land. The money's just his way of making it legal. Then we go to Copper Ridge tonight, Tommy said. I'll ride hard, see if anyone's buying. It's too late. Stores are closed. They sat in heavy silence, defeat settling over them like dust. Then Ellie tugged on Nora's sleeve and pointed to the stone oven, then to herself, then made a motion like she was pulling something out. You want to bake? Nora asked gently. Sweetheart, we're all too tired. But Ellie shook her head emphatically and pointed again, this time at all of them, then at the oven, then held up her fingers in the shape of a number. She's saying we should bake something special, Jack said slowly. Something worth the last $13. Understanding bloomed on Rowan's face. The wedding, it's tomorrow. They need the communion bread, but we could offer them a wedding cake too. Something elaborate, something worth $13, Nora finished. She looked at her bandaged hand, at the exhaustion carved into everyone's faces, at Ellie's determined expression. We'd have to work all night. Then we work all night, Rowan said simply. They worked. Nora designed a 3-tier cake decorated with intricate piping and sugar flowers. Rowan followed her instructions with painstaking care, his large hands surprisingly deft. Jack and Martin took turns keeping the oven at exact temperature. Tommy rode to the ranch owner's house to negotiate the price. And Ellie stayed awake through sheer willpower, her small presence a reminder of exactly what they were fighting for. By 3 a.m, the cake stood complete. It was beautiful. Possibly the most beautiful thing Nora had ever created. Delicate roses cascaded down the sides, and the smooth frosting gleamed like satin. Worth $13? Rowan asked. Worth 20, easy, Jack breathed. Tommy had returned with good news. The bride's mother had agreed to $15, so moved by their story that she'd added extra. At dawn on the 15th day, Rowan rode to town with $500 in his saddlebag and a determination that felt like armor. Nora waited in the yard, Ellie's hand in hers, not even pretending she wasn't terrified. 3 hours later, Rowan returned. He dismounted slowly, his face unreadable, and Nora's heart plummeted. They'd failed. After everything, Then he smiled. Actually smiled, his whole face transforming with it. It's done. The land is ours. Garrett's claim is void. The ranch erupted. Jack let out a whoop that scattered the chickens. Tommy and Martin embraced, laughing like children. Ellie jumped up and down, her face split by the widest grin Nora had ever seen. And Rowan walked straight to Nora, pulled her into his arms, and held her like she was the only solid thing in a spinning world. We did it, he murmured into her hair. You did it. We all did it, she corrected, but her voice was muffled against his chest, and her good hand was fisted in his shirt, and she couldn't remember the last time something felt this right. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were bright, and he looked years younger than he had just hours before. Tonight, he said, tonight we celebrate. No work, no worry, just being. That evening, they gathered around a bonfire in the yard. Jack produced a fiddle from somewhere and played old songs that made everyone's feet tap. Martin told increasingly embellished stories about the 2 weeks ordeal. Tommy attempted to dance and nearly fell into the fire. And Ellie laughed. The sound was rusty, like something unused for too long. But it was real and pure, and it made everyone stop and stare at the little girl who hadn't made a sound in over a year. Rowan's eyes filled with tears, and Nora had to look away from the raw emotion on his face. Later, after the fire had burned down and the ranch hands had stumbled off to bed, after Ellie had fallen asleep in her father's arms and been carried inside, Rowan found Nora sitting alone on the porch. He sat beside her without speaking, and they watched the stars wheel overhead in companionable silence. Finally, he said, I meant what I said before, about you being part of this place, about not wanting you to leave. I'm not planning to leave. Good. He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight his eyes were soft. Because somewhere in the last 6 weeks, you stopped being just the baker and became something else. What? Her heart was beating too fast. Something essential. He reached over and took her good hand in his thumb tracing her knuckles. Something I don't know how to live without anymore. Nora couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel the warmth of his hand and the weight of words neither of them was quite ready to say. Rowan, you don't have to say anything. His grip tightened slightly. I just needed you to know. They sat like that, hands linked, shoulders touching, hearts beating in a rhythm that felt like the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for but both of them desperately needed. And somewhere in the darkness, the prairie wind whispered promises that sounded like hope. October swept across the prairie with a painter's hand, turning the world into shades of amber and rust. The morning air carried a bite that promised winter wasn't far behind, and the cattle grew thick coats in preparation for the cold months ahead. Nora's hand healed slowly but steadily, the swelling fading until she could use all her fingers again, though the middle one still ached when storms approached. The ranch settled back into its rhythms, but something fundamental had shifted. The desperation of those 2 weeks had forged bonds that couldn't be undone, and the people who'd worked together to save the land now moved around each other with an ease that spoke of family rather than employment. Ellie still hadn't spoken, but her silence no longer felt like absence. She hummed sometimes while shaping dough, a tuneless melody that filled the kitchen with something close to joy. She'd started following her father around the ranch when she wasn't with Nora, a small shadow learning the work that would one day be hers. And every night, before bed, she would take both Nora's hand and Rowan's hand and hold them together, her dark eyes serious, like she was trying to solve a puzzle only she could see. Rowan and Nora danced around each other like people learning new steps. Their hands would brush when passing dishes. Their eyes would meet across the yard and hold for a heartbeat too long. Sometimes, late at night, Nora would find him on the porch and they'd sit in comfortable silence, shoulders touching, watching the stars wheel overhead. Neither spoke of feelings or futures, but the air between them hummed with unspoken possibilities. The ranch hands noticed, of course. Jack started finding reasons to leave Rowan and Nora alone together. Tommy grinned like he knew a secret whenever he saw them talking. And Martin made increasingly obvious comments about how nice it was to see the boss smiling again, until Jack finally told him to shut his fool mouth before he scared off the best thing that had happened to the ranch in years. It was the second week of October when the past came calling. Nora was in the kitchen, preparing the day's bread, when she heard horses approaching. Multiple riders again, but the sound was different this time. Heavier, more purposeful. She wiped her hands and stepped to the window, her stomach tightening with instinctive dread. 5 men rode into the yard. 4 of them wore the rough clothes of working men, but the fifth made Nora's blood turn to ice. Jeb Rourke sat astride a bay gelding, his hat pulled low, his heavy frame unmistakable even at a distance. He'd tracked her. Somehow, despite her careful disappearance, despite the 3 territories between them, he'd found her. Her first thought was to run. Her second thought was Ellie, who was upstairs in the main house. Her third thought was Rowan, who was somewhere in the north pasture and had no idea danger had just ridden onto his land. She stepped back from the window, her mind racing. She could hide, could stay quiet until they left. The kitchen door slammed open. Jeb filled the doorway, bigger than she remembered, his face flushed from riding and his eyes carrying the same possessive hunger that had driven her to flee in the first place. Behind him, his 4 companions spread out, blocking any escape. "There you are," Jeb said, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made her skin crawl. "Been looking for you for 3 months, Nora. 3 goddamn months." She forced herself to stand straight, to meet his gaze without flinching. "You have no right to be here." "No right?" He laughed, the sound harsh. "I got every right. You're my woman. Promise to me. You running off don't change that." "I never promised you anything. I told you no a dozen times." "Your mouth said no, but—" He stepped closer, and Nora instinctively backed up until she hit the counter. "But I know what you really wanted. You were just playing hard to get. Women do that." "I wanted you to leave me alone." Her voice shook despite her efforts to control it. "I want you to leave me alone now." "Can't do that." He reached out and she jerked away from his touch. His expression darkened. "Don't make this difficult, Nora. You belong in Silver Creek, with me. I got the bakery all ready for you. Got a house picked out. We can get married next week. Put all this foolishness behind us." "I'm not going anywhere with you." "You don't got a choice." His hand shot out faster than she expected and grabbed her wrist. His fingers dug in hard enough to bruise, and Nora gasped. "I've been patient. I've been understanding, but my patience is done. Let go of me. Not until you shut—" She said let go. Rowan's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade. He stood in the doorway with Jack and Tommy flanking him, and the expression on his face was one Nora had never seen before, cold and deadly and absolutely terrifying in its control. Jeb turned, still holding Nora's wrist, sizing up the 3 men with the arrogance of someone who'd brought his own reinforcements. "This ain't your business, friend." "The hell it isn't." Rowan's gaze flicked to where Jeb's hand gripped Nora, and something dangerous shifted in his eyes. You're on my land, touching my employee. That makes it my business. Your employee? Jeb laughed. That's a nice way of putting it. Though I heard you got yourself a whole setup here. Playing house with a ready-made family, using my woman to do it. I'm not your woman, Nora said, trying to twist her wrist free. Jeb's grip only tightened. Nora, did you invite this man here? Rowan asked, his voice eerily calm. No. Do you want him here? No. Then he's trespassing. Rowan took a step forward. You got 5 seconds to remove your hand from her and get off my property. Jeb sneered. Or what? You gonna fight me? Fight all 5 of us? He gestured to his companions. I got numbers on my side, friend. Numbers don't mean shit when you're in the wrong. Jack's hand rested on his gun. And you're definitely in the wrong. The tension in the kitchen ratcheted up to breaking point. Nora could feel Jeb's anger radiating off him in waves, could see his companions shifting nervously, could sense the violence coiling in the air like a spring wound too tight. Jeb, please, she tried one more time. Just leave. There's nothing for you here. You're here. That's everything. He pulled her closer, and she could smell the whiskey on his breath, could see the obsession burning in his eyes. I love you, Nora. Don't you understand that? Everything I've done for you. That's not love. The hell it isn't. His free hand came up to her face, and she flinched away. I can make you happy. I can give you everything you need. You just gotta stop being so stubborn and... Rowan moved. One moment he was standing by the door, the next he was across the kitchen, ripping Jeb's hand from Nora's wrist and shoving him back with enough force to send him stumbling. Nora barely had time to register what was happening before Jeb recovered and swung. His fist connected with Rowan's jaw with a crack that made Nora's stomach turn. But Rowan barely moved, just absorbed the hit and came back with his own punch that split Jeb's lip and sent blood spraying across the floor. Then all hell broke loose. Jeb's companions rushed forward, and Jack and Tommy met them with equal fury. The kitchen erupted into chaos, fists flying, bodies slamming into furniture, the sound of breaking wood and shouted curses. Nora pressed herself against the wall, her heart in her throat, watching Rowan and Jeb trade blows with a violence that spoke of something more than just this moment. Rowan was fighting for her, fighting to protect her, fighting with a ferocity that said he'd die before letting anyone take her away. Jeb was bigger, heavier, but Rowan was faster, angrier, and fighting with the kind of desperation that came from having already lost too much. He landed a punch to Jeb's ribs that made the bigger man grunt, then followed with an uppercut that snapped his head back. But Jeb wasn't going down easy. He grabbed Rowan around the middle and they crashed through the table, splintering wood beneath them. They rolled, each trying to gain advantage until Jeb ended up on top, his hands going for Rowan's throat. No! Nora screamed, looking frantically for something, anything. Her hand closed around a cast-iron skillet. She didn't think, just swung with every ounce of strength she possessed, connecting with the side of Jeb's head with a clang that reverberated up her arms. He toppled sideways, dazed, and Rowan scrambled up, breathing hard. For a moment, silence. Everyone frozen, staring at Nora with the skillet still raised, her chest heaving, her eyes wild. Then Jeb moved, reaching for something at his belt, and Nora saw the knife a second before he pulled it free. Enough! The word came from the doorway, and everyone turned to see Martin standing there with a rifle leveled at Jeb's chest. His hands were steady, his expression grim. Drop the knife and get out, or I put a hole in you that won't heal. Jeb looked around the kitchen, at his companions nursing various injuries, at Rowan ready to go another round despite the blood on his face, at Jack and Tommy blocking the exits, at Nora holding the skillet like a weapon, at Martin with the rifle that promised death if he moved wrong. This ain't over, he spat, blood dripping from his split lip. Yeah, it is. Rowan's voice was rough. You come back here, you so much as think about Nora again, and I'll kill you. That's not a threat. That's a promise. Something in Rowan's tone must have convinced Jeb because he finally dropped the knife, his face ugly with rage and defeat. She ain't worth dying for. That's where you're wrong. Rowan moved to stand beside Nora, close enough that their shoulders touched. She's worth everything. The words hung in the air, simple and absolute, and Nora felt tears prick her eyes. Jeb sneered one last time, then gestured to his men. Come on, let's get out of this hellhole. As he passed Nora, he leaned in close enough to whisper, "You think you're safe here? You think he'll keep wanting you when he learns what you really are? Women like you, you're all the same, worthless." Then he was gone, his companions limping after him, the sound of their horses fading into the distance. The kitchen looked like a tornado had hit it. The table was destroyed, chairs overturned, blood spattered across the floor. Jack had a cut over his eye. Tommy was favoring his ribs. And Rowan had the beginnings of a black eye, a split lip, and his knuckles were raw and bleeding. They stood in the wreckage, breathing hard, and then Tommy started laughing. Just started laughing like he'd lost his mind, and then Jack joined in, and soon even Martin was chuckling despite the rifle still in his hands. "What the hell is funny?" Rowan demanded. "You." Tommy wiped his eyes. "You just fought 5 men for a woman you claim is just your employee." He had it coming. Oh, he definitely had it coming. Jack grinned despite the blood running down his face. "But you might want to examine why you were so eager to deliver it." Rowan's jaw tightened, and he looked at Nora with an expression that made her breath catch. "Are you all right?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Did he hurt you?" "No, I'm fine." The skillet slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. "Rowan, I'm sorry. I didn't know he'd come here. I didn't think—" "Hey." He crossed to her in 2 strides, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "This isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. He came because of me. He destroyed your kitchen, hurt your men, and we sent him running with his tail between his legs." His thumb brushed her cheek, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Nora, look at me." She did, and the intensity in his gray eyes nearly undid her. "I don't care who comes looking for you or what they think they have claim to. You're under my protection now. Mine." The possessiveness in his voice should have scared her, but instead it felt like safety. "And I protect what's mine." "I'm not yours," she whispered, but the words lacked conviction. "Aren't you?" His hand cupped her face, his touch impossibly gentle despite his battered knuckles. "Because it sure as hell feels like you are. Feels like you have been for weeks now, and I've just been too scared to say it." Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. "Rowan." A small gasp from the doorway made them both turn. Ellie stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She must have heard the fighting, must have hidden upstairs until it was over. Now she stared at her father's battered face, at the destroyed kitchen, at the blood on the floor, and her small body started to shake. "Sweetheart," Rowan started toward her, but Ellie flinched back, and the hurt that crossed his face was terrible to witness. Nora moved without thinking, kneeling down to Ellie's level. "It's okay. Your papa's okay. We're all okay." Ellie shook her head, tears streaming down her face, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to speak, but couldn't find the words. "I know it looks scary," Nora continued softly, "but sometimes people have to fight to protect the things they love. Your papa was protecting me, protecting all of us. He's a hero." Ellie looked past Nora to Rowan, something shifting in her expression, and then she was running, not away, but toward him, throwing herself into his arms with enough force to make him stagger. Rowan caught her, holding her tight, his eyes squeezed shut against emotion too big to contain. "I'm okay, baby. I'm okay. I promise." Over Ellie's head, his gaze found Nora's, and the look in his eyes said everything words couldn't. The ranch hands quietly excused themselves to tend their own injuries, giving the family, because that's what they'd become, whether they acknowledged it or not, space to breathe. Nora set about cleaning the kitchen while Rowan held his daughter, neither speaking, just being. After a while, Ellie pulled back and very carefully touched her father's split lip, her brow furrowed with concern. "It's just a cut," he assured her. "I've had worse." She turned to Nora and pointed at the medical supplies, then at her father, her meaning clear. "You want me to patch him up?" Nora asked. Ellie nodded emphatically. So Nora brought water and clean cloths, and while Ellie watched with serious attention, she cleaned the blood from Rowan's face. Her hands were gentle, her touch careful, and she tried not to think about how intimate this felt, tending his wounds, being this close, feeling his breath on her skin. "This is becoming a habit," Rowan murmured. "You taking care of me. You took care of me first. When I burned my hand. when the storm came. She dabbed at his split lip. This might sting. I can handle it. But he winced anyway, and Ellie made a soft sound of sympathy. When Nora finished, she started to pull back, but Rowan caught her hand, his fingers threading through hers. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For staying. For not running when you could have. His thumb traced circles on her palm. For hitting him with that skillet. That was... He shook his head, something like admiration and fear mixing in his expression. That was the bravest and most terrifying thing I've ever seen. He was going to kill you. So you were going to kill him first. If I had to. The admission came easily, and Nora realized with startling clarity that it was true. She would have done anything, to protect Rowan, to protect Ellie, to protect this fragile, precious thing they were building together. The realization must have shown on her face because Rowan's expression shifted, going soft and fierce all at once. Nora, I need to... A knock at the door interrupted him. Jack stuck his head in, looking apologetic. Sorry, boss, but we got a problem. Storm's coming in fast, and the cattle in the east pasture are going to be right in the middle of it. We need to move them now. Rowan's jaw tightened with frustration, but he nodded. Give me 5 minutes. Jack disappeared, and Rowan stood, still holding Nora's hand. We'll talk. After, about everything. Everything? Everything. He glanced at Ellie, who was watching them with those two knowing eyes. You okay here for a few hours? We'll be fine, Nora assured him. Go. Do what you need to do. He hesitated, like he wanted to say more, then leaned in and pressed his forehead to hers, just for a moment, just long enough for her to feel the warmth of him, the solidness, the promise. Then he was gone, and Nora was left standing in the destroyed kitchen with Ellie's hand in hers, and her heart beating a rhythm that sounded like his name. The storm hit with the fury of winter arriving early. Wind screamed across the prairie, driving rain sideways, turning the world into a gray blur. Nora and Ellie watched from the window of the main house, both wrapped in quilts, waiting for the men to return. 3 hours passed, then 4. The storm showed no signs of abating, and Nora's worry grew with each passing minute. Moving cattle in this weather was dangerous, made worse by the failing light and the lightning that cracked across the sky like veins of fire. Ellie fell asleep against her shoulder around dusk, exhausted from the day's emotions. Nora carried her upstairs to her room, tucked her in carefully, and stood watching the little girl sleep. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and Nora felt a fierce protectiveness wash over her that had nothing to do with employment and everything to do with love. When had it happened? When had Ellie stopped being Rowan's daughter and become simply hers? When had this child worked her way into Nora's heart so completely that the thought of leaving felt like amputation? She didn't know, couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. But it had happened, as inevitable as seasons changing, as undeniable as the storm raging outside. Downstairs, she rebuilt the fire and made coffee, needing something to do with her hands. The destroyed table lay in pieces in the corner, evidence of the violence that had erupted just hours ago. She should clean it up, should do something productive, but instead she found herself sitting in Rowan's chair by the fire, wrapped in a quilt that smelled like him, waiting. The front door crashed open near midnight, and Rowan stumbled in with rain streaming off him, exhausted and soaked to the bone. Jack and Tommy followed, equally drenched, all of them looking like they'd fought a war and barely won. Cattle? Nora asked, already moving to get towels. Safe, Rowan managed. Got them moved just in time. He accepted the towels she offered, their fingers brushing, and even exhausted and battered, the contact sent electricity through her. The ranch hands declined her offer of coffee, heading to the bunkhouse to collapse, leaving Nora alone with Rowan in the warm kitchen. She poured him coffee, added honey the way she'd learned he liked it, and set it in front of him. He wrapped his hands around the mug, his knuckles bruised and raw, and stared into the dark liquid like it held answers. Ellie? He asked finally. Asleep upstairs, she was worried about you. And you? Nora met his gaze across the table. I was terrified. I'm sorry. Don't be. She sat down across from him. I know what you do is dangerous. I know there are risks. She paused, searching for words. I can't lose you. Either of you. Rowan set down his mug with deliberate care. Nora, we need to talk about what happened today. I know. That man, Jeb, he's the reason you left Colorado. It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. He decided I was going to marry him. Wouldn't take no for an answer. Got more aggressive, more possessive. One night he cornered me in the bakery after closing. He grabbed me, and when I fought back, she touched the scar on her wrist, hidden beneath her sleeve. I knew if I stayed, he'd find a way to make me his, whether I wanted it or not. So I ran. Rowan's expression went dark. I should have hit him harder. You hit him plenty hard. Despite everything, she almost smiled. I've never seen anyone move that fast. He touched you, put his hands on you, in my house. The possessiveness in his voice was back, raw and unmistakable. I would have killed him if Martin hadn't stopped it. I know. She reached across the table, covering his battered hand with hers. But you didn't. You protected me without becoming what he is. That's what matters. He turned his hand over, threading his fingers through hers, and for a long moment they just sat there, connected by something stronger than words. When I saw him grab you, Rowan said finally, his voice low, something in me just snapped. All I could think was that I'd finally found something good, something worth keeping, and he was trying to take it away. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Worth keeping. That's you, Nora. You're what I want to keep. Her heart stuttered. Rowan, I know the timing's bad. I know today was hell. I know I'm still a mess from losing Marie, and Ellie's still healing, and you just got your life back. The words came faster now, like he'd been holding them back too long. But I can't pretend anymore. Can't pretend you're just the baker. Can't pretend I don't look for you first thing every morning. Can't pretend my heart doesn't stop when you smile. Nora couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel the weight of his words settling into her like warmth after cold. I'm falling in love with you, he said simply. Hell, I've probably been falling since you showed up 3 months late covered in dust and refused to apologize for it. And I know that's not fair to you. Know you came here to escape, not to... She kissed him, just leaned across the table and pressed her lips to his, stopping the words, stopping the doubt, stopping everything except the feeling of finally, letting herself have something she wanted. He froze for a heartbeat, then his hand came up to cup her face, and he was kissing her back with a tenderness that made her throat tight. His lips were gentle despite their split, careful, asking permission with every movement. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Rowan rested his forehead against hers. Is that a yes? He asked, his voice rough. That's a yes. She pulled back enough to see his face. I'm falling in love with you too, with you and Ellie and this whole impossible place. I didn't mean to. I tried not to, but sometimes things happen whether we plan them or not. Yeah. She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. Sometimes they do. He kissed her again, slower this time, deeper, and Nora let herself sink into it, let herself believe that maybe she could have this, could have happiness, could have a future that wasn't defined by running away. When they finally pulled apart, Rowan's eyes were bright, and he looked younger than she'd ever seen him, like someone had lifted a weight he'd been carrying for too long. Stay, he said. Not as the baker, not as an employee. Stay as... He paused, searching for the right words. As mine, as Ellie's, as part of this family. Nora thought of the life she'd left behind in Colorado, the bakery, the routine, the safety that had turned into a cage. Then she thought of this place, this ranch, these people who'd fought for her without hesitation. She thought of Ellie's small hand in hers, of bread rising in the dawn light, of Rowan's rare smiles and the way he said her name like it meant something. I'll stay, she whispered, for as long as you'll have me. Then that's forever, he said simply, and kissed her again to seal the promise. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, surrounded by warmth and the smell of coffee and the solid presence of the man she loved, Nora finally felt safe. They fell asleep in Rowan's chair, tangled together like people who'd been doing it for years instead of hours. Nora woke at dawn to find Ellie standing in front of them, her dark eyes moving between her father and Nora with an expression that looked remarkably like satisfaction. Rowan stirred, his arms tightening around Nora before his eyes opened. When he saw his daughter watching them, he went still. "Morning, sweetheart," he said carefully, like he wasn't sure how she'd react to finding them like this. Ellie looked at them for a long moment. Then she smiled, really smiled, wide and genuine, and climbed into Nora's lap, snuggling between them like she'd been waiting for this exact configuration her whole life. Rowan's eyes met Nora's over his daughter's head, and the wonder in his expression made her chest ache. "I think she approves," Nora whispered. "I think she's been planning this longer than we have," he replied, and there was laughter in his voice, the kind that came from relief and joy and the sheer improbability of happiness. The next weeks passed in a haze of new beginnings. Rowan rebuilt the kitchen table himself, making it sturdier than before, his hands sure on the wood. The ranch hands watched the evolving relationship with barely concealed approval, Jack going so far as to mutter that it was about damn time. Tommy started asking Nora's opinion on things that had nothing to do with baking, treating her like the lady of the house, even though no official declaration had been made. And Martin just smiled his quiet smile and worked harder than ever, like good fortune might be contagious. Nora moved through her days in a state of cautious wonder. She'd bake in the mornings with Ellie at her side, the little girl's presence as natural as breathing. She'd look up to find Rowan watching from the doorway, and the heat in his gaze would make her flush. They'd stolen kisses when Ellie wasn't looking, against the barn wall, in the pantry, once memorably in the stone oven shed that resulted in flour in both their hair and laughter that felt like freedom. But they were careful, respectful, neither pushing too fast, both aware that Ellie needed to adjust, that the town would talk, that appearances mattered in a place like this. It was killing them both slowly. "We should get married," Rowan said one evening. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, Ellie asleep upstairs, the prairie wind carrying the scent of coming winter. Nora's heart jumped. "That's quite a leap from our first kiss 2 weeks ago." "Is it?" He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "We already live together, work together, raise Ellie together. We already act like we're married. The only difference is the paper and the promise. And those things matter." "They do." He took her hand, his thumb tracing her knuckles. "So let's make it official. Let's tell the town and the world that you're mine and I'm yours, and anyone who has a problem with it can go straight to hell." She laughed despite the emotion clogging her throat. "That's quite a romantic proposal." "I can do better." He slid off the chair and onto one knee, right there on the weathered porch. And suddenly Nora couldn't breathe. "Nora Callahan, you showed up here 3 months late, covered in dust, and changed everything. You saved my ranch, brought my daughter back to life, and made me remember what it feels like to want a future. I know I'm not an easy man. I know I've got ghosts and grief and a daughter who deserves better than a father who's still figuring things out. But I love you. God, I love you so much it scares me. So will you marry me? Will you stay here and build something with me that lasts?" Tears spilled down Nora's cheeks, and she didn't bother wiping them away. "Yes. Yes, of course, yes." He stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that had been building for weeks, months maybe, since the first time she'd left bread for his daughter, since the first time he'd seen her shape dough with those capable hands, since the first time he'd realized that loneliness didn't have to be permanent. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Rowan pressed something into her palm. It was a ring, simple silver, worn smooth with age, with a small stone that caught the moonlight and threw it back in shades of blue. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "She wore it for 40 years, through good times and bad, through drought and plenty. She told me to give it to someone who understood that marriage wasn't about the easy days, but about showing up for the hard ones." His voice roughened. "That's you, Nora. You showed up when things were impossible, and you stayed. You fought. So this is yours now if you want it." Nora looked at the ring, at the weight of history and promise it carried, and then at the man offering it with his heart in his eyes. "It's perfect," she whispered. He slipped it onto her finger, a little loose, but nothing that couldn't be fixed, and kissed her again, softer this time, like a vow. They were married 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning that dawned clear and cold. The first snow had fallen the night before, just a dusting, turning the prairie into something clean and new. Nora wore a simple blue dress that had been Marie's. Rowan had offered it with hesitant hands, explaining that his late wife would have wanted it, that she'd been the kind of woman who believed in love continuing rather than ending. Nora had cried when she accepted it, understanding the gift for what it was, permission from the past to build a future. The ceremony took place in the meadow behind the house, the same meadow where they'd fought the fire weeks ago, where ash and destruction had given way to new growth. The whole town came, more out of curiosity than blessing. A widower remarrying so soon raised eyebrows, and a mysterious woman from Colorado marrying into the Miles Ranch raised more questions than anyone wanted to voice aloud. But Nora didn't care about whispers. She stood beside Rowan in the cold morning air, Ellie between them holding a bread loaf she'd shaped herself, a crooked heart that listed slightly to one side but was perfect in its imperfection, and said vows that felt like breathing. I promise to stand beside you in the hard times and celebrate the good ones. I promise to raise your daughter like she's mine, because she already is. I promise to build something with you that lasts, that weathers storms, that becomes stronger with each passing year. Rowan's voice was rough when he spoke his vows. I promise to protect you, to honor you, to never take for granted the gift of your presence in our lives. I promise to be worthy of the love you give so freely. I promise to show up every day for as long as we both breathe. The preacher pronounced them married, and when Rowan kissed her, the crowd erupted in applause that startled the cattle in the far pasture. Ellie threw her bread heart in the air like a bouquet, and it landed in Tommy's hands, making everyone laugh. The celebration afterward was simple: bread and honey cakes, coffee and cider, fiddle music that made feet tap and hearts lift. The ranch hands danced with anyone willing, Jack executing a surprisingly graceful two-step with the blacksmith's widow. Martin attempted to teach Ellie a jig, resulting in both of them collapsing in giggles. And Tommy flirted shamelessly with half the unmarried women in town, his red hair bright in the winter sun. Rowan and Nora barely left each other's sides, hands linked, shoulders touching, existing in a bubble of new marriage joy that made them oblivious to everything but each other. "You're stuck with me now," Nora murmured during a slow dance, her head on his shoulder. "I've been stuck with you since you hit that bastard with my skillet," he replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Best thing that ever happened to me." As the sun set and the guests began to leave, Nora stood on the porch watching the prairie turn gold and crimson, feeling the weight of the ring on her finger, the warmth of Rowan's arm around her waist, the solid presence of Ellie holding her hand. This was home. Not the shed where she'd slept those first weeks, not even the ranch itself, but these people, this moment, this fragile and fierce thing they'd built together out of flour and fire and sheer stubborn hope. But the past, it seemed, wasn't quite finished with them yet. 2 days after the wedding, Nora was in the kitchen when she heard a rider approaching. Not multiple riders this time, not the threatening thunder of Jeb Rourke's return, but a single horse moving at a measured pace. She looked up to see a man dismounting, older, weathered, with a badge pinned to his chest that caught the morning light. Sheriff Davies from Copper Ridge. She'd seen him at the wedding, a silent presence at the back of the crowd, watching with eyes that missed nothing. Rowan emerged from the barn, his expression going wary when he saw the lawman. "Sheriff? Something I can help you with?" "Maybe." Davies removed his hat, his gaze finding Nora through the kitchen window. "Actually, it's your wife I need to speak with, if that's all right." Nora's stomach dropped. She set down the dough she'd been kneading and wiped her hands, forcing herself to walk outside with her head high. Whatever this was, she'd face it. "Mrs. Miles," Davies said, and the use of her new name felt both strange and grounding. "I need to ask you some questions about a man named Jeb Rourke." Rowan moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and protective. "He was here a few weeks back. Made threats. We sent him on his way." "I know." Davies shifted his weight. "That's actually why I'm here. Rourke was found dead 3 days ago. Shot twice in the back, left in a ravine about 10 miles south of here." The world tilted. Nora heard the words but couldn't quite process them. Jeb was dead. The man who'd haunted her for months, who'd driven her across 3 territories, who'd nearly destroyed everything she'd built. Dead. You think we had something to do with it? Rowan's voice went hard. I'm not accusing anyone, just gathering information. Davies pulled out a notebook. Mrs. Miles, I need you to tell me about your relationship with Rourke. So she did. Told him everything. The unwanted courtship, the escalating aggression, the night she'd fled, the confrontation in this very kitchen. Rowan stood beside her the entire time, his hand on the small of her back, anchoring her. When she finished, Davies made a few notes, then looked up. And where were you 3 days ago? Here. Working. I haven't left the ranch since the wedding. She met his gaze steadily. I didn't kill him, Sheriff. I wanted him gone, wanted him to leave me alone, but I didn't want him dead. What about you, Miles? You made some pretty serious threats that day. I meant every word, Rowan said flatly. But I didn't act on them. Check with my ranch hands. They can account for my whereabouts. Davies nodded slowly, his eyes moving between them. I believe you, both of you. Truth is, Rourke made a lot of enemies. Could have been any number of people who put those bullets in him. He tucked away his notebook. But I had to ask. Had to make sure. Are we in trouble? Nora asked. No, ma'am. You're clear. He settled his hat back on his head. Though I'll tell you, unofficially, that the world's probably better off without Jeb Rourke in it. Man like that, who can't take no for an answer, who thinks he owns people. Well, some problems solve themselves eventually. He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Nora and Rowan standing in the yard, the news settling over them like snow. He's dead, Nora said finally, testing the words. He's really dead. Yeah. Rowan pulled her into his arms. How do you feel? She thought about it, searching her heart for grief or guilt or relief. What she found was mostly numbness, with an edge of something that might have been freedom. I feel like I can breathe, she admitted, like there's one less thing in the world trying to hurt me. Is that terrible? No. He kissed the top of her head. That's honest. And after everything he put you through, you're entitled to feel however you feel. They stood there for a long moment, and Nora let herself lean into his strength, let herself accept that sometimes the universe solved problems in ways people couldn't or wouldn't. Ellie appeared from the house, clutching her doe horse, and looked up at them with questioning eyes. Everything's okay, sweetheart, Rowan assured her. Just someone asking questions, nothing to worry about. But Ellie studied Nora's face with that too knowing gaze, then reached up and took her hand, squeezing once before tugging her toward the kitchen. Time to bake. Time to create something good from flour and water and heat. Time to move forward. As November deepened into December, life at the ranch settled into new rhythms. Nora moved her few possessions from the shed into the main house, into the room that had been Marie's and was now hers. The first night she spent there felt strange, like wearing someone else's clothes, but Rowan had kissed away her uncertainty with patient hands, and words that reminded her this was their beginning, not Marie's ending. Ellie's silence continued, but it no longer felt like absence. She communicated through gestures, through the bread she shaped, through the way she'd take Nora's hand and lead her to something that needed attention. A torn dress, a loose board on the porch, once memorably, a bird with a broken wing that they'd nursed back to health in a box by the stove. The little girl had appointed herself guardian of the new marriage, watching her father and Nora with the vigilance of a general, ensuring his troops behaved. When Rowan kissed Nora in the kitchen, Ellie would giggle silently and cover her eyes, peeking through her fingers. When they sat together in the evenings, she'd wedge herself between them, claiming both their laps, making sure neither felt neglected. She's playing matchmaker to people already matched, Rowan observed one night, watching his daughter arrange them on the couch like dolls. She's making sure it sticks, Nora corrected. Making sure this is real and permanent. It is real. It is permanent. He caught Nora's hand over Ellie's head. Nothing's going to change that. But change came anyway, as it always did, in forms both expected and surprising. The first snow of significance fell in mid-December, turning the ranch into something from a winter fairy tale. The stone oven became even more crucial, its heat a gathering point for everyone seeking warmth. Nora experimented with winter baking, dark breads heavy with molasses, gingerbread that filled the house with spice, rolls studded with dried fruit that Martin declared were worth dying for. The ranch hands had become family in truth, eating most meals in the main house now, their presence filling rooms that had been too quiet for too long. Jack taught Ellie to whittle, patiently showing her how to shape wood into simple animals. Tommy regaled them with increasingly embellished stories of his exploits, most of which no one believed but everyone enjoyed. And Martin, quiet Martin who rarely spoke, revealed himself to be a talented harmonica player, filling winter evenings with music that made feet tap and hearts lift. Rowan thrived in ways Nora hadn't expected. Marriage agreed with him, softened some of the hard edges grief had carved. He smiled more readily, laughed at Tommy's jokes, played with Ellie in the snow like a man remembering how to be young. And at night, in the privacy of their room, he loved Nora with a tenderness that made her weep, not from sadness, but from the sheer overwhelming gift of being chosen, being wanted, being home. "I never thought I'd have this again," he confessed one night, his hand tracing patterns on her skin. "After Marie died, I thought that part of my life was over, that I'd just exist until Ellie was grown, then, I don't know, fade away maybe." "And now?" Nora asked. "Now I want to live 100 years. Want to see Ellie grow up and have children of her own. Want to turn gray with you and argue about bread recipes when we're old." He kissed her softly. "Want to build something that outlasts us both." It was during the third week of December, during a baking session with Ellie, that everything changed. They were making bread horses, a tradition now, every Tuesday, when Ellie's dough horse collapsed in her hands. The little girl stared at the misshapen lump, her face crumpling, and then to Nora's shock, she laughed. Not the silent, rusty laugh from months ago, but a real laugh, bright and clear and unmistakably audible. Nora froze, her hands buried in dough, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell had been cast. Ellie looked up, her eyes wide with her own surprise. Then she laughed again, the sound filling the kitchen like bells. "Ellie?" Nora whispered. The little girl opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Her face scrunched with concentration, with effort, with the enormous task of breaking a year of silence. "Ma." The sound was barely a whisper, rough from disuse. "Mama." The world stopped. Nora couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could only stare at this child who'd just given her a gift more precious than gold. "Mama," Ellie said again, stronger this time. And then she was crying and laughing simultaneously, and Nora was crying too, pulling the little girl into her arms and holding her like she could keep her safe from every bad thing the world might throw at them. "Yes, baby," Nora managed through her tears. "Yes, I'm here. I'm your mama now." Ellie pulled back, her face wet, her smile radiant. "Mama? Bake?" It was such a simple request, such an ordinary question, but it meant everything. It meant trust. It meant healing. It meant a future where voices mattered and could be used and would be heard. "Yes, sweetheart," Nora said, her voice thick. "We'll bake." They were shaping new dough horses when Rowan came in from the barn. He took one look at their tear-stained faces and went pale. "What happened? What's wrong?" "Papa!" Ellie launched herself at him, and he caught her automatically, confusion and fear warring in his expression. "Papa, Mama, and me baking." The words tumbled out in a rush, clumsy and beautiful. "My horse broke and I laughed, and then I talked, and Mama cried, and—" Rowan's knees gave out. He sank to the floor still holding his daughter, and his face did something complicated, joy and grief and relief all crashing together. "You talked," he said wonderingly. "Baby, you talked." "I talked." Ellie touched his face with her small hands. "I have words now, Papa. Lots of words." She frowned, concentrating. "They've been inside, but now they're coming out." Rowan looked at Nora over his daughter's head, and the gratitude in his eyes was so intense she had to look away. "Thank you," he mouthed. But Nora shook her head. This wasn't her doing. This was time and healing and safety and love. Things they'd all given and received in equal measure. This was what happened when people stopped just surviving and started living. That evening, the ranch hands were summoned for an impromptu celebration. Ellie demonstrated her newfound voice by talking nonstop for 2 hours, making up for a year of silence with enthusiasm that left everyone exhausted but grinning. She told them about her dough animals, about the bird they'd healed, about how snow was cold but also fun, about how Tommy's hair looked like fire, about how Jack smelled like horses, but in a good way. The men bore her chatter with patience that surprised no one. They'd been waiting for this too, hoping for it, praying for it in their own ways. "Best Christmas present there ever was," Jack said gruffly, wiping his eyes when he thought no one was looking. "Amen to that," Martin agreed. Tommy just grinned and let Ellie braid his fire-colored hair into increasingly ridiculous styles, declaring each one a masterpiece. Late that night, after Ellie had finally exhausted herself into sleep, after the ranch hands had returned to the bunkhouse still smiling, Rowan found Nora standing on the porch, looking out at the snow-covered prairie. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I was thinking about how far we've all come." She leaned back against his chest. "4 months ago, I was running from a man who thought he owned me. You were drowning in grief. Ellie was locked in silence. And now we're here." He rested his chin on top of her head. "Married, happy. Ellie talking a mile a minute. Life is strange, isn't it?" "Strange and wonderful." She turned in his arms to face him. "Rowan, I need to tell you something." His expression grew concerned. "What is it?" "I think—" She paused, gathering courage. "I think I might be pregnant." The words hung in the cold air between them, crystallizing like frost. Rowan went very still. "You think?" "I'm 2 weeks late, and I've been feeling strange in the mornings. It could be nothing, but—" She searched his face for reaction, suddenly terrified she'd miscalculated, that this was too much too soon, that— He kissed her so thoroughly that she forgot about cold and fear and everything except the way he held her like she was made of something precious and impossible. When they broke apart, he was grinning like a fool. "A baby. We're having a baby. Maybe. Probably. I'm not certain yet. But maybe." He picked her up and spun her around, and she laughed despite her uncertainty, despite the fear, despite everything. "Rowan, put me down. What if I'm not? What if it's a false alarm?" "Then we try again." He set her down gently, his hands cradling her face. "But Nora, the fact that we could, that we might, God, that's everything." She saw it then, not just joy at the possibility of another child, but the deeper gift of what it meant. A future, a continuation, proof that life kept going, that love kept growing, that the universe still held room for new beginnings. "I love you," she said, the words feeling inadequate for the size of what she felt. "I love you too." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You and Ellie, and this maybe baby, and this ranch, and this whole ridiculous, beautiful, impossible life we're building." They stood there on the porch as snow began to fall again, holding each other against the cold, and Nora thought about weddings and bread and words spoken after silence. She thought about running and fighting and finally, standing still. She thought about home and realized with startling clarity that it had never been a place. It had always been this: arms that held her, voices that called her name, hearts that beat in rhythm with her own. The prairie wind whispered through the darkness, carrying the scent of snow and possibility, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Nora wasn't afraid of tomorrow. She was looking forward to it. Christmas arrived with a snowstorm that buried the ranch in white silence. The cattle huddled in the barn, the horses stamped restlessly in their stalls, and inside the main house, warmth radiated from both the stove and the people gathered around it. Nora had been right about the pregnancy, confirmed by the doctor in Copper Ridge, who'd smiled at Rowan's barely contained joy and told them to expect a summer baby. The news had spread through the ranch like wildfire, and now the hands treated Nora like she was made of glass, which annoyed her to no end but secretly pleased her more than she'd admit. Ellie had appointed herself guardian of her future sibling, talking to Nora's still flat belly with the seriousness of a general addressing troops. "You be good in there," she'd say, her small hand pressed against Nora's stomach. "Don't kick Mama too hard, and hurry up growing because I want to teach you things." "What things?" Nora would ask, amused. "Important things, like how to make bred horses, and which chickens are mean, and how Papa looks scary but he's really soft inside." This last part always made Rowan cough suspiciously and leave the room muttering about checking on livestock. The storm kept them housebound for 3 days, and they made the best of it. Nora baked until the house smelled like a bakery from heaven. Cinnamon rolls, gingerbread, bread so fresh it steamed when cut. Jack carved wooden animals for Ellie with patience that suggested he'd done this before, for children lost to time or distance. Tommy taught everyone a card game that involved more cheating than actual rules, resulting in arguments that dissolved into laughter. Martin played his harmonica, the notes melancholy and sweet, speaking of winters past and springs hoped for. And Rowan watched his expanding family with an expression that made Nora's heart clench. She'd catch him looking at her with such naked wonder, like he couldn't quite believe his fortune, like he was afraid to blink in case it all disappeared. On Christmas Eve, after Ellie had finally fallen asleep, her small hand clutching the wooden horse Jack had carved for her, Rowan found Nora in the kitchen. She was cleaning up the day's baking, humming tunelessly, her hands moving through familiar motions. "Leave it," he said. "Come with me." "Where are we going?" "You'll see." He helped her into her coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and led her outside into the crystalline night. The storm had passed, leaving the world transformed. Snow reflected moonlight until everything glowed silver blue, and the stars overhead burned so bright they looked close enough to touch. Rowan led her to the meadow where they'd married, where ash had given way to new growth, where promises had been spoken in the cold morning air. "I wanted to give you something," he said, reaching into his coat. "It's not much, but—" He pulled out a small wooden box, hand-carved with surprising delicacy. Inside, nestled in cloth, was a locket, silver, simple, with an intricate pattern etched into its surface. "It was Marie's," he said quietly. "I know that might be strange, giving you something of hers, but I think she would have wanted you to have it. She believed in love continuing, in family expanding rather than ending." He opened the locket, revealing 2 small spaces for photographs. "I thought, maybe we could put Ellie in one side, and when the baby comes, we can add them to the other, a family that keeps growing." Nora's throat closed with emotion. "Rowan, I can't. You can. Marie would have liked you, I think, would have appreciated what you've done for Ellie, for me, for this place." His voice roughened. "She'd be grateful you loved us when we needed it most." Nora took the locket with shaking hands, feeling the weight of history and blessing. "Thank you. For this. For everything. For giving me a place to belong. You gave me that first." He fastened the locket around her neck, his fingers gentle on her skin. "You gave me back my daughter's voice. You gave me reasons to smile. You gave me a future when I'd convinced myself I didn't deserve one." She turned in his arms, looking up at his face in the moonlight, seeing the man who'd been broken and was slowly becoming whole. "We saved each other, I think." "Yeah." He kissed her softly, sweetly, a kiss that tasted like promises kept and futures imagined. "We did." They stood there in the frozen meadow, holding each other against the cold, and Nora thought about all the paths that had led her here, the fear that had driven her from Colorado, the desperation that had made her accept a job site unseen, the small acts of kindness that had spiraled into something bigger than she could have imagined. Every choice, every moment, had been leading to this, standing in the snow with a man she loved, carrying his child, wearing a ring that spoke of permanence and a locket that spoke of continuity. "Merry Christmas, Nora," Rowan murmured against her hair. "Merry Christmas, Rowan." January brought a thaw, and with it, unexpected visitors. Nora was in the kitchen. Always in the kitchen, it seemed, her hands happiest when buried in dough, when she heard horses approaching. Multiple riders, but the sound was different from Garrett's threatening arrival or Jeb's violent intrusion. This sounded almost official. She wiped her hands and stepped outside to find 3 men dismounting. The first was Sheriff Davies, his expression unreadable. The second was a man she didn't recognize, older, well-dressed, carrying a leather satchel that marked him as some kind of professional. The third made her heart stop. It was Reverend Michaels from Silver Creek, the minister who'd presided over her parents' funerals, who'd known her since she was a girl, who'd watched her build her bakery from nothing. "Mrs. Miles," Davies said, tipping his hat. Hope we're not intruding." Rowan emerged from the barn, his expression immediately wary. He moved to stand beside Nora, a silent wall of protection, and she loved him for it even as she stepped forward. "Reverend Michaels," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Miss Callahan, forgive me, Mrs. Miles now, I understand." The Reverend looked older than she remembered, his hair whiter, his face more lined. "I wouldn't have come if it wasn't important." The well-dressed man stepped forward. "Mrs. Miles, my name is Thomas Hendricks. I'm a solicitor from Denver. I've been searching for you for quite some time." He opened his satchel and pulled out a thick envelope. "It concerns your late uncle, Samuel Callahan." Nora blinked in surprise. "Uncle Samuel? I haven't seen him since I was a child." "Nevertheless, you're his sole surviving heir." Hendricks handed her the envelope. "He passed away last September, left you his estate, a property in Denver, some investments, and a sum of money. All told, it comes to approximately $12,000. The number hit like a physical blow. $12,000. It was a fortune, enough to buy 10 ranches, enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life, enough to never worry about money again. Rowan's hand found hers squeezing gently, and she realized she'd gone pale. "I don't understand," she managed. "Why did he leave it to me?" "According to his will, he had no children of his own, and you were his favorite niece. He spoke highly of your talent as a baker, your independence, your strength." Hendricks produced more papers. "There are conditions, of course. The property in Denver is yours free and clear, but the investments are held in trust until you turn 30, at which point they'll transfer completely. The cash sum is available immediately." Nora looked at the papers in her hands, at the official seals and legal language that represented a future she'd never imagined. Security, independence, the ability to never have to depend on anyone again. She looked at Rowan, saw him watching her carefully, his expression neutral, but his eyes betraying a flicker of fear. He was thinking she might leave, thinking this fortune might take her away from the ranch, from Montana, from him. "There's more," Reverend Michaels said gently. "The property in Denver, your uncle used it as a bakery. One of the finest in the city, from what I understand. It's yours now, Nora. The bakery you always dreamed of having, in a city big enough to make you famous." The words hung in the cold air, a temptation wrapped in opportunity. Everything she'd wanted when she'd left Silver Creek: security, respect, a place that was entirely hers. All of it waiting in Denver, just 3 days' ride away. "I need to think about this," Nora said finally. "Of course." Hendricks produced a card. "You can reach me at this address when you've made your decision, but I should mention there's interest from buyers if you'd prefer to sell the Denver property. I can arrange that as well." The men left after declining coffee, and Nora stood in the yard holding papers that represented a different life, a different future. Rowan hadn't moved, his body tense, waiting for her to speak. $12,000, she said finally. "That's life-changing." His voice was flat. "You could do anything, go anywhere." "I could." "Denver's not far. You could run that bakery, make a name for yourself, become everything you were meant to be." Each word sounded like it was being pulled from him with pliers. "I wouldn't stop you, wouldn't ask you to give up an opportunity like this." Nora looked at the papers, then at the ranch, at the house where Ellie slept, at the barn where Jack was probably teaching horses his particular brand of patience, at the kitchen where her bread rose every morning, at the stone oven she'd rebuilt with her own hands. She looked at the land that had saved her, at the people who'd become family, at the man who'd given her his mother's ring and his late wife's blessing. "You're right," she said finally. "This is life-changing. So let me tell you what I'm going to do with it." Rowan's jaw tightened, bracing for loss. "I'm going to put half of it in trust for Ellie, for her future, her education, whatever she needs when she's grown." Nora stepped closer to him, watching his expression shift from resignation to confusion to hope. "I'm going to use some of it to expand the ranch. Maybe buy that adjacent property you've been eyeing. Fix up the bunkhouse so the hands have better quarters. Build a proper bakery building so I'm not taking over the kitchen constantly." "Nora, and the Denver property?" "I'm going to sell it. Use that money to hire more hands, buy better equipment, maybe even start selling our bread in more towns." She reached up and cupped his face with flour-dusted hands. "Because my life is here, Rowan. My family is here. My home is here. A bakery in Denver, no matter how fine, can't compete with what we've built." His eyes closed, and when they opened again, they were bright with unshed tears. "You'd give up all that for this? For us?" "I'm not giving up anything. I'm choosing what matters." She pulled his face down to hers. "I'm choosing you. I'm choosing Ellie. I'm choosing this impossible, beautiful, difficult life we're making together. That's not a sacrifice, Rowan. That's the easiest choice I've ever made." He kissed her then, deep and desperate and relieved, his hands gentle on her growing belly, his heart beating against hers in perfect rhythm. When they finally broke apart, they found Ellie standing on the porch, watching them with her serious dark eyes. "Mama's staying?" she asked, her voice small and worried. "Mama's staying," Nora confirmed, "forever and always." Ellie's face split into a grin, and she ran to them, wrapping her small arms around both their legs. "Good, because the baby needs you, and Papa needs you, and I need you most of all." "I know, sweetheart." Nora lifted her daughter, because that's what Ellie was now, in every way that mattered, and held her close. "I need you too." The expansion began in February. Rowan hired a carpenter from Copper Ridge to design a proper bakery building, something that would house the stone oven, provide workspace, and include a storefront where they could sell directly to customers who'd begun making regular trips to the ranch, specifically for Nora's bread. The building would be attached to the main house by a covered walkway, close enough for convenience but separate enough to keep the living spaces from being overwhelmed by flour and heat. Jack supervised the construction with the same attention he gave to horse training, ensuring every board was straight, every nail driven true. Tommy volunteered to help with the heavy lifting, his young strength invaluable as walls went up and the roof took shape. And Martin, quiet Martin who spoke more through action than words, carved a sign for the building that read simply, "Miles Ranch Bakery, Estent 1875. Nora worked alongside them when her growing belly allowed, planning the layout, choosing where equipment would go, imagining the flow of work. This would be her kingdom, her domain, a place entirely hers, and yet part of the larger whole that was their ranch, their family, their life. Ellie helped by bringing water and staying out from underfoot, her chatter filling the worksite with life. She told anyone who'd listen about the baby coming, about how she'd be the best big sister, about how she'd already picked out names even though Papa said that was Mama's job too. "What names did you pick?" Tommy asked one day, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Rose for a girl, because Mama likes flowers. And," Ellie paused dramatically, "and Samuel for a boy, after Mama's uncle who was nice enough to die and leave us money." Tommy choked on his water. Jack turned away to hide his laughter. Even Rowan, who'd been listening from across the yard, had to cover his mouth. "Ellie," Nora said gently, trying not to smile, "that's very sweet, but maybe we should think of other names too." "Why? Samuel's a good name, and he won't mind because he's dead." There was no arguing with that logic. By March, the bakery building was complete. It was beautiful in its simplicity, clean lines, good light, space designed for efficiency and comfort. The stone oven had been moved and reinstalled, even better than before, with improved ventilation and heat distribution. There were proper work surfaces, storage for supplies, even a small area with chairs where customers could sit and enjoy fresh bread with coffee. The day they opened for business, people came from 3 towns over. Word had spread about the baker at Miles Ranch, about bread so good it was worth a 20-mile ride, about a woman who'd saved a ranch through determination and dough. They bought everything Nora had prepared, sold out by noon, and placed orders for the following week that would keep her busy for days. "We're going to need help," Rowan said that evening, watching Nora tally the orders with a mixture of pride and concern. "You can't do all this alone, especially with the baby coming." "I know." She leaned back against him, tired but satisfied. "I've been thinking about asking around in town. Maybe there's a young woman who wants to learn the trade. Or maybe," Jack said from the doorway, "there's someone closer than you think." He stepped aside and a woman entered, middle-aged, sturdy, with flour permanently embedded under her fingernails, and the kind of face that suggested she'd seen hardship but refused to be broken by it. "This is Margaret O'Brien," Jack said. "Known her for years. Best baker in Copper Ridge until her husband died and she lost the shop. She heard you might need help." Margaret looked at Nora with sharp, assessing eyes. Jack says you're good. Says you've got a touch that can't be taught. Says you could use someone who knows their way around an oven. Can you start tomorrow? Nora asked, making a decision in an instant. Something about Margaret felt right. Solid, dependable, the kind of person who'd show up even when things got hard. Margaret's stern expression cracked into a smile. I can start now if you need me. Tomorrow's fine. Nora extended her hand. Welcome to Miles Ranch. With Margaret's help, the bakery thrived. Orders doubled, then tripled. They couldn't keep up with demand, which was a good problem to have. Margaret proved to be not just skilled, but intuitive, understanding dough the way some people understood horses or weather. She and Nora worked in comfortable rhythm, two women who spoke the language of flour and heat and transformation. April brought rain that turned the prairie green and soft, and with it, Nora's belly grew round and undeniable. She could no longer hide her pregnancy behind aprons, not that she tried. She wore it like a badge of honor, proof that life continued, that love created, that futures were being built one day at a time. Ellie became obsessed with the baby, reading to Nora's stomach from her small collection of books, singing songs she'd learned from Tommy, once trying to feed the baby directly by pushing bread against Nora's belly button until Rowan gently explained that wasn't how it worked. But the baby needs to eat, Ellie protested. The baby eats what Mama eats, Rowan explained. Then Mama should eat more. The baby's probably hungry. She turned to Nora with serious eyes. You should have 3 breakfasts, just to be safe. Rowan caught Nora's eye over their daughter's head, and they both struggled not to laugh. It was a Thursday in late May when the pain started. Nora was in the bakery teaching Margaret a particularly tricky braiding technique when the first contraction hit hard enough to take her breath away. She gripped the counter, breathing through it, waiting for it to pass. How far apart are they? Margaret asked calmly, already untying her apron. This is the first. Another contraction cut off her words, and Nora realized with sudden clarity that this baby wasn't going to wait for convenient timing. Jack! Margaret's voice carried across the yard. Get Rowan, now, and someone ride for the doctor. What followed was controlled chaos. Rowan appeared at a dead run, his face going pale when he saw Nora doubled over. He scooped her up despite her protests that she could walk, carrying her to the house like she weighed nothing. Margaret and Jack moved with military efficiency, water boiling, clean cloths appearing, the bedroom transformed into a birthing room. Ellie was ushered to the bunkhouse with Tommy, who looked terrified at being responsible for a child during such a critical moment. Just keep her distracted, Margaret instructed. Tell her stories, play games, whatever it takes. The labor was long and hard. Nora had expected pain, but not this. Waves of agony that crashed over her until she lost track of time, of everything except Rowan's hand in hers and his voice in her ear murmuring encouragement. You can do this, he kept saying. You're the strongest person I know. You saved a ranch through sheer will. You can do this. I can't, she gasped during a particularly brutal contraction. Rowan, I can't. You can. You are. Just breathe. He pressed his forehead to hers. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. The doctor arrived sometime after midnight, examined Nora, and declared she was doing fine, though his definition of fine seemed wildly optimistic given the circumstances. Margaret assisted him with calm competence, and Rowan refused to leave despite the doctor's suggestion that most men preferred to wait elsewhere. I'm staying, Rowan said, his tone brooking no argument. She's my wife. I stay. Hours blurred together, pain and pressure in Rowan's steady presence, Margaret's calm instructions, the doctor's professional assessment. And then, as dawn broke over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, a baby's cry split the air. It's a boy, the doctor announced, placing the tiny, furious infant on Nora's chest. Congratulations. Nora looked down at her son, red-faced and wailing, perfect in his imperfection, and felt something in her chest crack open with love so fierce it hurt. He's beautiful, she whispered. He looks like an angry potato, Rowan said, but his voice was thick with emotion and his hand shook as he touched the baby's tiny fist. The most beautiful angry potato I've ever seen. The baby's fingers wrapped around Rowan's thumb, and just like that, the man who'd been made of stone and grief completely fell apart. He pressed his face against Nora's shoulder, his body shaking with sobs he'd probably been holding back for hours, and she held him with one arm while cradling their son with the other. "Thank you," he managed. "Thank you for this. For him. For everything." "We made him together," she reminded him gently. "This is both of us." When Ellie was finally allowed in to meet her brother, she approached the bed with uncharacteristic shyness. She stared at the baby for a long moment, her expression serious, then looked up at Nora with worried eyes. "He's very small," she said. "He'll grow," Nora assured her. "Can he hear me if I talk to him?" "He can." Ellie leaned close to her brother, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Hello, baby. I'm your big sister, Ellie. I'm going to teach you lots of things, like how to make bread and how to be brave and how Papa pretends to be tough, but really he cries at everything." She paused. "Mama said I can help take care of you, but I won't let you eat my dough horses. You have to make your own." Rowan choked on a laugh, and Nora pulled Ellie onto the bed beside her, creating space for their daughter to curl up next to them. The four of them stayed like that for a long time, a family, complete and imperfect and absolutely real. "What are we naming him?" Rowan asked eventually. Nora thought about Ellie's suggestion of Samuel, about honoring the uncle who'd given them security, about all the names they'd discussed over the months. But looking at her son, at his dark hair and strong grip, and the way he'd already stolen his father's heart, only one name felt right. "James," she said. "James Samuel Miles." "James?" Rowan tested the name, smiling. "Yeah, that's perfect." The ranch hands took turns visiting over the next few days, each bringing gifts. Jack, a carved cradle that must have taken months to make. Tommy, a blanket his own mother had sent. Martin, a silver cup engraved with the baby's name and birth date. They held James with unexpected gentleness, these rough men who worked with cattle and horses, their faces softening as they cooed at the infant who'd become theirs to protect and spoil. Margaret brought food for weeks, casseroles and soups and bread that freed Nora from cooking while she healed. She also quietly took over most of the bakery work, insisting Nora needed time to recover, to bond with her son, to simply be. "The bakery will still be there in a few weeks," Margaret said firmly. "Babies are only this small once. Don't waste it working when you should be living." So Nora lived. She spent her days in a haze of feeding and sleeping and marveling at the small human she'd created. She watched Ellie embrace her role as big sister with fierce devotion, bringing James toys he was too young to appreciate and reading him stories in her high, clear voice. She watched Rowan transform from competent rancher to anxious new father, convinced that every tiny sound the baby made indicated mortal peril, until she finally had to remind him that babies were tougher than they looked. "How did I do this with Ellie and not lose my mind?" he asked one night, pacing with James, who'd been crying for an hour. "You had Marie to tell you everything was fine," Nora said from the bed, exhausted but content. "Are you telling me everything's fine?" "Everything's fine." She watched him walk the floor, watched the way he held their son with infinite care, and felt her heart expand even further. "You're a good father, Rowan. You always have been." He looked at her, at James, at the life they'd built from ash and determination. "I used to think I'd lost everything. Used to believe the best parts of my life were behind me." He settled into the chair beside the bed, still holding the now sleeping baby. "I was so wrong." "We both were." Nora reached out, and he took her hand, linking them together. "We were both drowning and somehow managed to save each other. Best decision I ever made, hiring a baker 3 days late covered in dust. Best decision I ever made, accepting a job from a man who terrified me." He laughed quietly, careful not to wake James. "I terrified you? You were all storm clouds and hard edges. I thought you were going to fire me before I even started. I thought you were going to run away the moment things got hard." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "Never been happier to be wrong." Summer came on strong, turning the prairie into a sea of gold beneath endless blue sky. James grew from angry potato into alert infant, his dark eyes tracking movement, his small fists grabbing at everything within reach. Ellie appointed herself chief entertainer, making faces and singing songs that usually resulted in the baby spitting up on her, which she took as a sign of deep affection. The bakery flourished under Margaret's capable management. They'd hired 2 additional helpers, young women from town who wanted to learn the trade, and were now selling to 5 different towns, with orders coming in faster than they could fill them. Nora had insisted on profit sharing, giving Margaret a percentage of earnings that made the older woman's eyes bright with tears. "You don't have to do this," Margaret had protested. "Yes, I do. You're not just an employee, Margaret. You're a partner. You should be compensated as one." Nora had squeezed her hand. "Besides, you've become family, and family takes care of each other." It was true. Margaret had moved into one of the newly renovated rooms in the bunkhouse, becoming a permanent fixture at the ranch. She ate meals with them, helped with the children, provided wisdom when needed, and silence when that was better. She'd become the grandmother Ellie had never had, the friend Nora desperately needed, the steady presence that made everything run smoother. In July, they held a celebration, ostensibly for James's 2-month birthday, but really an excuse to gather everyone who'd become important to them. The whole town seemed to come, spilling across the yard in a riot of food and laughter and music. Tommy's fiddle battled Jack's harmonica, while Martin called steps for dancing that devolved into chaos. Children ran wild, including Ellie, who'd declared herself mayor of all kids and was organizing games with dictatorial efficiency. Nora stood on the porch holding James, watching the celebration, feeling the weight of the locket at her throat and the ring on her finger. She thought about the woman she'd been 7 months ago, running, afraid, convinced that safety meant being alone. She thought about how wrong she'd been, how much she would have missed if she hadn't stayed, if she hadn't fought, if she hadn't let herself love and be loved in return. Rowan found her there, sliding an arm around her waist, pressing a kiss to her temple. "What are you thinking about?" "About how far we've come. About everything that had to happen to bring us here." She leaned into him. "About how grateful I am that I was 3 days late and covered in dust. I'm grateful you ignored my stupid rules and left bread for Ellie anyway. I'm grateful you didn't fire me for it. Never could have." He took James from her arms, cradling their son with practiced ease now. "From the moment you stood in my yard and refused to apologize for being late, I think some part of me knew you were going to change everything." "Good changes?" "The best changes." He kissed her properly, deeply, in front of God and the whole town and anyone who might have opinions about public displays of affection. "You turned a house back into a home. You gave me back my daughter's voice. You gave me a son and a future and reasons to wake up smiling." He pulled back, his eyes serious. "You saved me, Nora. In every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," she corrected, just like she had before, just like she'd keep saying until he believed it. "That's what people who love each other do." As the sun set and the party continued into the purple twilight, as Ellie danced with Tommy and Margaret laughed at something Jack said, as neighbors became friends and friends became family, Nora felt the final piece of her broken past slot into place and heal over. She'd run from Silver Creek searching for safety and found so much more. She'd hidden in a shed behind a barn and discovered a home. She'd agreed to bake bread for 2 months and ended up building a life that would span decades. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of coming autumn, of harvest and preparation and the endless cycle of seasons. But for now, for this moment, there was only summer, warm and golden and full of promise. Rowan pulled her close, James nestled between them, and Ellie ran up to grab both their hands, pulling them toward the dancing. "Come on," she insisted. "Tommy said he'll play our song." "We don't have a song," Rowan protested. "We do now." Ellie was already dragging them forward, and Nora and Rowan exchanged glances that held years of history and futures yet to come. They danced in the yard as stars emerged overhead, as music filled the air, as their son slept peacefully and their daughter laughed with pure joy. They danced because they could, because they'd survived to reach this moment, because love, messy and complicated and absolutely worth fighting for, had given them this. And later, much later, when the guests had gone and the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Rowan found Nora in the kitchen. She was checking on tomorrow's bread. Old habits died hard, and he simply wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said for the 1,000th time, and she knew he'd say it 1,000 times more. "For what?" "For being 3 days late, for staying when you could have run, for loving us when we needed it most. He turned her to face him, his hands framing her face, for being the answer to prayers I didn't know how to pray. Nora rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promises kept and promises yet to make. Thank you for hiring me, for protecting me, for giving me a family when I thought I'd always be alone. Never alone, he murmured against her lips. Not anymore. Not ever again. And in the warm kitchen that smelled of bread and home, surrounded by the evidence of lives well lived and love freely given, Nora Callahan Miles finally, completely let go of fear and embraced the truth she'd been running toward all along. Home wasn't a place. It was people. It was flour and fire, and small hands shaping dough. It was a man who'd learned to smile again, and a daughter who'd found her voice, and a son who'd never know a world where he wasn't wanted. It was ranch hands who'd become brothers, and a business partner who'd become family, and a town that had learned to trust the stranger who'd blown in covered in dust and changed everything. Home was here. Home was now. Home was this impossible, beautiful, hard-won life they'd built together from nothing more than hope and determination and bread that tasted like love. And that, Nora thought, as Rowan kissed her again, and the bread continued to rise and the prairie wind sang its ancient song, was more than enough. It was everything.